Chapter 1 of Secrets of the Friendly Woods. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Secrets of the Friendly Woods by Rex Brasher. Chickadee Valley. We'll give you $125 cash or 10 cents apiece for every tie, cutting nothing under 8 inches. Nowadays this offer would seem of little moment, but when made, 12 years ago, it was something to be seriously considered. Hereabout, interchange of labor replaced cash to a large extent. To accept an offer of real money seemed advisable. It meant many months' freedom for artistic inclinations. 10 cents per tie undoubtedly would bring the total higher, but in scattered and deferred amounts. Although it was a long way ahead, I visualized the winter. Slim pickings without cash, but a filled pantry with it. Just then $125 was really a great deal of money. Intermittently the teams hauled load after load down the mountainside, 2,800 ties and many thousand feet of lumber. Apparently I had lost $155 by accepting the cash offer. One day in October, Ed drove into our road behind a splendid pair of workhorses to carry a load of our apples Dover way for cider. Ruddy-cheeked, clear-eyed, he's the best shot and fisherman for miles around. Straightforward, square, Ed is a fine type of the old New England pioneers. "You've had the rough end of the stick in this tie deal, Rex. Charlie and I have talked it over, and we're going to give you that 100 cords of slabs on the hill." "Well, that's certainly white of you, Ed. Guess I can use 'em." In truth, they proved a real godsend. A chute was built, 600 feet long, to the woodshed, thereby eliciting the remark from the road commissioner that I was the laziest man in Kent, for I shot my wood right into the kitchen. Maybe, but that stack of cut wood saved many an hour with the axe and allowed me to swing a paintbrush instead. For over 4 years the slabs kept the stove going. Of course I mixed them with heavier stuff. Rough end of the stick, eh? Well, they were worth $1,000 to me. It was real fun to put them in at the head and see them go skittering down against the butt. When the slide was wet, they traveled. Make no mistake about that. After 2 or 3 of the heavier ones had threatened to demolish the north end of the house, I had to reduce their weight and speed by chopping them in 2. Those who attempted to dissuade me from burying myself alive little understood either me or the possibilities. Another illustration of the individual's inclination to judge only from his own standpoint. For them the city held all that was desirable, and outside of it there could be nothing worth while. Mine was a different point of view, and no regrets have come to me for following the solitary trail. Seasons, birds, trees, sunrise, and friends. Wasaokwe, Morris, alert, loyal, ready to help or give, a worker from the heart out. Kentway, Ed, steady, dependable, kind, with the same readiness to lend a hand. And others. Fortunate indeed to count these men friends, for the type is fast vanishing. The finger of fate which directed me here was this ad. Farm, 150 acres, half wood, half brook pasture, good house, barn, and buildings, terms reasonable. That was the lure. Cold type in the list of abandoned farms in the New York State, and I took it as a bluefish takes a squid. The usual line, near school and town, did not appear, and the omission added to its attractiveness. For years I had been roaming the woods, fields, and streams, gathering material for paintings of our North American birds, and I was looking for some remote spot where I could put into finished form the collection of sketches and notes. Behind lay the days when from the little Phalarope's deck I'd watch suns rise and set. I lived for over a year on the sloop, traveling the intricate waterways down the eastern shore, from Maine to Florida. Into the past, too, had gone the days afield which sometimes provoked the query, "Are you going to waste all your life? Aren't you ever going to settle down to anything?" etc. Heredity came to my support. A descendant of seamen, possibly of pirates, shouldn't be affected by words. These ancestors had been accustomed to giving commands, and would have received criticisms on the point of their swords. Alas, the days of the cutlass are gone. All one can do now is to take these gratuitous remarks as part of the job and forget them. Live as your manhood bids you live. From none save self expect applause. A dreamer, yes, everything man produces is formed first in his mind. We had no complete work and color of our birds, and my special dream was to produce one, for I loved these bits of feathered life and envied their control in a medium closed to man, the air. Objection? Yes, I know, aviation, but that isn't the way a bird flies. Man will never attain such proficiency unless he grows feathers and increases his muscular power about 50 times. On the map, Dover Plains, New York, looked as close to the farm as Kent, Connecticut. So early one March morning, 2 of us started from the former town. The winter had been open, the ground was bare, the air crisp and sharp. Redwings were ocaling along the banks of 10 Mile River. Little flocks of juncos flashed their white tail signals at frequent intervals, and meadowlarks expressed a firm conviction that spring was here. We made for a little farmhouse lying under the Taconic hills ahead. How does the written place and the other valley bear from here? Right over there, pointing east, but I'm telling you, you'd better take the road. It's 3 miles across those mountains, and if you get into Wolf's Swamp, it'll be a job getting out. Around by Peaked Mountain we went 9 miles. In the rough country we ran into, returning across the range that afternoon, showed us that taking that friendly caution had been wisdom. The muddy road held back our eager feet, but the little white house under the lee of Buffalo Mountain came into view about 10 o'clock. A veteran of the Civil War was caretaker. This fact prevented my expression of amazement when I discovered that every corner of the rooms had been utilized as tobacco juice repositories. I am no believer in the rule, speak only good of the dead, but in this instance my restraint is a tribute to his soldierly qualities. Examination showed the outside condition of the dwelling to be but slightly weathered. The most optimistic real estate operator would not have had the assurance to insert the near school and town remark in light of the farm's location, 4 miles from Kent and a quarter mile off the main road, buried as far as it could be on the eastern slope of these Taconic hills without ascending the mountain, but snuggled comfortably under Old Buffalo. Winter nor'westerns would not strike us. It was a cheerful thought, for I was tired of wind. My eyes, grown dim from watching the sun wash on the brine, would recover among these friendly hills. The house was built on a side slope, but a wall of large rocks, mainly dragged out of the 10-foot cellar excavation, had been erected just east of it, giving a level space all around where tin cans, old shoes, and other debris had been scattered with a liberal and careless hand. A 2-foot wide foundation sunk to the solid ledge, meaning permanency. Even the worst southeaster has failed to extract a tremor. The paint was still a protection, although beginning to peel. The price was small. We took the place. There was much to do, but slight vision was necessary to see an attractive home a few years ahead. The former owner, old Alonzo Ritten, was not only a moonshiner, but a character. His specialty was metheglin, a derivative of fermented honey. I've never tasted it, but those familiar with this particular brand of lightning say it was real old 40-rod stuff. His principal business was its manufacture and distribution among the charcoal burners who in his day were numerous among these hills. They say he collected most of their monthly pay. There must be some truth in this report, because he left $5,000 in the bank. It is certain he never accumulated that amount by working this collection of rocks as a farm. Slowly the pencil marked off numbers on the AOU checklist, indicating a completed watercolor. Storm outside meant more accomplished inside, and winter always produced the largest number of marks. When the Phoebe returned in March, perched on the porch roof, remarking emphatically, "Here be," and the song sparrow's merry tinkle came from the willows, brush strokes grew more languid, and some days the sable point was exchanged for a 4-inch flat, and part of the house was painted. Oh, there was plenty to do. Outside, no guardian angel stood by to smooth out the creases. That had to be done with a hammer and saw. But inside, well, I don't think it wise to give too much praise. I might not get any dinner. There was work, too, down the road. Maybe a barn or a house to build. When the commissary department remarked that the supply of milk, coffee, and general provender was getting low, tools were gathered in a box and carried where there was financial use for them. When I was alone, the problem of living bothered me little. One winter, a flock of 68 leghorns paid all expenses. My reputation for truth would evaporate if I were to tell here the weekly outlay. Within 75 miles of New York City, no telephone, no electric light, no car, and what's more, I don't miss them. Sphinxian glances from party opposite. Fill up the oil barrel, the pantry, the cellar, and the woodshed every autumn, shut the doors, keep stoves a-going, and paint. Some years old Boreas kept the door shut. One winter 6 weeks went by before the snow road was broken out. How do you get to town? Well, we own skis and snowshoes. That's one way, but mostly we don't. Even a rough winter like that has its compensations. A lot more little marks made on the checklist. There were 1,201 species and subspecies to do. Plumage phases running this up into 3,000 different figures, and over 80% of them life-size. Years drifted by. The call of the sea grew faint, but here in this remote nook other notes awoke. The first robin against February snows, atoms of crimson and bare apple boughs when the Ides of March bring a drift of purple finches. April, whitethroats with their notes of crystal rain, peepers, and the woodcock's gape when some mysterious impulse draws me to the window for a last look at every night which falls. May, with its chaos of exultant song. Even in July the wood thrush's liquid notes at dawn and twilight. A wood thrush and my favorite song sparrow are having a duet now. A pair of black ducks which have nested in our meadow, winnowing past when they take their evening exercise flight. A grouse throbbing through the soft October haze. Foxes barking, and rarer, weird screams of wildcats. Horned owls hooting under winter stars. No, I do not miss the sea. Romance is dead as the wail of the present. True, there are no more frontiers to conquer, Indians to pursue, or letters of marque authorizing us to scour the 7 seas. Pirates? They too have disappeared, save where in the far Formosan mists they glide upon the unwary trader. Is romance dead? Look around you. Artists at work on the casting for a new turbine, turning down a 50-ton shaft at an enormous lathe, fitting delicate watch gears at a table, holding the throttle on a flyer, directing from the bridge the course of a liner. Adventure is all. Romance gone? No. Only following different trails. Perhaps the greatest adventure is to know what you want to do, and do it. If this is true, mine was finished when all the little feathered fellows were portrayed on paper and snugly stowed away in a fireproof studio. There is another adventure ahead. The sunset gun. If any sounds of earth do travel into the infinite, I hope to hear the very singing from the hemlocks in early dawn, or when that weird pale green light fills the valley after a squall has passed. End of Chapter 1. Chapter 2 of Secrets of the Friendly Woods by Rex Brasher. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Who's Who in the Blue? 1. When the government dredge finished gnawing its way down the Indian River, it was decided to cut through the narrow ribbon of beach and tow the big thing north on the broad Atlantic. Unless scouring tide conditions are right, artificial inlets along the eastern coast seldom remain open. Frequently the first norther will close them completely, smoothing over the sand until none would guess an opening had ever been made. All day under double reefs the sloop Philohela had logged a steady 7 knots down the Indian River, reaching Gilbert's Cut at 4 bells in the late afternoon. Sheets were flattened. With wind abeam the sloop flew, the crescendo of surf deepening to a steady roar. The mighty Gulf Stream, driving on a good 5 miles an hour into the teeth of half a gale, was heaving shoreward tremendous waves which burst upon the outer reef scarcely 100 yards from the beach. Here the 100-fathom curve came close to shore, and the 12-foot seas were crashing upon the barrier unchecked by shoal water. Tracking back and forth on the sheltered mill pond inside, 2 men on the sloop watched the display of limitless power. Old Nep is certainly paddling his fingers around something outrageous. I guess we won't stick our bowsprit into those fellows tonight. Get a dunking, sure, remarked the skipper. That goes as you said it. Fine chance we'd have of making Lake Worth Inlet in the smother. The lee of Sewall's Point will look good to me, said the mate. Toward that point we drove. The mainsail swung inboard as land blanketed the wind. A figure before a fire on the shore hailed us. Sloop ahoy! Ahoy yourself! You boys come ashore and have supper with me. All right. Have you ever eaten fresh fried pompano in the open, with the trade winds snoring through palmettos overhead? If not, do it. Your life isn't complete until that experience has been yours. Maine? You come from there? Why, Harpswell's my hometown. Shake again. Came down here 3 years ago on a Portland schooner and been drifting around ever since. Stay 2 winters and you're gone. Blood thins out so you can't stand a New England winter. Just now I'm running a string of gill nets. Been doing pretty well, too, till I sprained my wrist 2 days back. We'll string your gear for you until your hand gets better. Well, I guess you fellows know how to do it. Seems like an answer to prayer, though I never made any. You boys must be Christians? No, blue domers and golden rulers. Never heard of 'em. Anyway, you're white. Literally, this statement was scarcely true. We were tanned a warm shade of umber brown, but metaphorically. Next morning we boated the 2 gill nets, the owner going along to show us where to make the best sets. These nets are only 4 feet deep, and for 2 men who had handled heavy purse seines on a Gloucesterman, it was child's play getting this light twine overboard. When it was all wet, we shipped our oars, lighted pipes, and lay by for an hour before underrunning. A fishhawk came into view, flying down the St. Lucie River. About 1/8 of a mile away he paused, fluttering in the air. Watch that fellow, he's going to strike. Strike he did, like a 6-pound heaving lead, as he dropped a bald eagle shot from his lookout perch ashore and dived downward. The white-headed robber had waited until the osprey was falling on his prey, but something was wrong. Instead of rising with a fish in his rough blue-gray claws, the osprey was thrashing violently and being dragged through the water. With the menacing freebooter above, the unmanageable fish below, our friend had fallen into trouble. He's hooked something that's too big to lift and can't let go. Out oars. We've got to rescue him before he's dragged under. By the time we reached the scene of conflict, the hawk was nearly drowned. He had been hauled repeatedly beneath the surface, and each time a longer interval elapsed before his reappearance. A grouper and a 15-pounder at that, exclaimed the skipper, unhooking the hawk's talons from the fish's back. What in thunder did you think you were doing, tackling a fish like that? Lucky it wasn't heavy or you'd been a goner. Even had the bird been capable of answering, he was too exhausted to do so. Lying in the bottom of the boat, gasping for air. Rowing ashore, we placed him on the warm beach and watched him slowly recover to wing his way languidly off. The whole proceeding doubtless puzzled the eagle, but it did not scare him away from the locality. That same afternoon we saw him swoop down over another fishhawk, may have been the rescued one, frightened it into dropping its catch, then in a lightning continuation of the same sweep, seized the relinquished prey before it struck the water. The old villain had sped enough for that feat, yet was too lazy to do his own fishing. Maybe he doesn't like a bath. 2. Now, while we have the country's emblem upon the screen, let us shift the scene, an easy task for the writer and scarcely less difficult for the reader. The backdrop is a small mountain rising sheer on its south and east sides, 600 feet. On the west, the ascent is more gradual, and from the north it is possible to drive a horse to the summit. The side scenes are hills, but with more rolling contours. Between lies Chickadee Valley on the eastern edge of Dutchess County, close to the Connecticut line. 15 years ago, Peaked Mountain was covered with splendid pines, and on one of the ledges a pair of eagles had their home. Those trees and birds have disappeared, the former under the lumberman's saw, and the latter probably by the gun of some cheap murderer. Although woefully scarce in this section, eagles are not entirely extinct. Every year I see one or more of their soaring forms above the blue, the sunlight glistening on snow-white head and tail. Their keen eyes no longer monopolize the wonderful tapestry of field, forest, and river spread far beneath. Men's longing to soar in this illimitable air and view Earth's panorama from unstable heights is materialized. True, it does not do it with the eagle's ease, grace, and silence, but 'tis accomplished. Perhaps when mastery of the air becomes more nearly perfect, man's thoughts and mind will broaden like the wide spaces below the aviator's vision. 3 years ago, while picking huckleberries atop Buffalo Mountain, a mile northwest of the house, I saw an eagle coasting through the intervale below, and for the first time I looked upon the back of this majestic bird in flight. How easily he slipped along, pinions motionless, wide stretched, the perfection of effortless progress. Last summer the roof needed reshingling, and one day I was hard at the task. A shadow swept across. Overhead, within 50 feet, a fine, pure, dusky black, immature bald head glided along. A quarter of a mile away, like a bolt of black lightning, he shot earthward. I rushed below for the glasses and just caught a glimpse of something twisting in his claws before the windbreak of hemlocks intervened. It was probably a woodchuck, although the distance was too great for me to be certain. Next day, while I was finishing the ridge, the noblest Roman of them all appeared. With quick, impetuous wing beats, a duck-hawk, one of the few true falcons, flew leisurely by, reconnoitering. Watching, I hoped some quarry would wake him to action, for there is always a thrill in the sight of this imperial bird at top speed. Some automobile manufacturers boast their cars will accelerate from 5 to 50 miles in 8 seconds. Slow. Here is a machine which can shift from 15 to 60 in 1 second. To tempt him into a stoop, I should have almost been willing to have him mistake my head for a rabbit. There is nothing in telepathy, for he went on over the hill with that characteristic flight which enables an observer to identify him when he is merely a black speck in the distance. Several years ago, a pair of duck-hawks preempted a homesite in the Palisades opposite New York City, making frequent visits to town after the pigeons, which constituted a large proportion of their food. A rather interesting instance of the extremity to which adaptation to environment can be carried. Here was a pair of these impetuous birds, normally at home in the wildest fastnesses, doing their hunting in city streets and on housetops. I have seen them perched on the Brooklyn Bridge towers, where they seem strangely out of place, the ultimate contrast between primitive nature and the apex of civilization. Of course, every bird-bug considered a visit to the nest a sacred duty, and toward that spot they gravitated like Mohammedans to Mecca, with the result that those unfortunate falcons had even less privacy than Irving Cobb's famous goldfish. But they were game, and notwithstanding innumerable peering heads, probably would have raised a family had not some enterprising collector sneaked down at night and stolen the eggs. I've no doubt a large percentage of the audience coveted those treasures, but the majority would have voted a firing squad for the actual thief. May his shadow grow thin. The peregrine's unhesitating courage and readiness to attack occasionally lead them into surprising situations. On November day, concealed among the reeds in a blind, I was contemplatively smoking and seriously considering broaching the luncheon puncheon when a projectile shot over and hit one of the decoys, knocking its head completely off. The only one of the 3 participants of this incident exhibiting no astonishment was the wooden imitation. The falcon was more than nonplussed. He flew off as though actually chagrined, perhaps because his aim was poor in hitting the head instead of the back. That was the only time I've ever seen this fierce and domineering bird exhibit indications of feeling like a fool. Many thanks fair fate for directing his attack to the fraudulent duck instead of the jug. In describing the falcon's onslaught, some writers state it rakes the body of its victim with its claws. This may add extra gory dramatic to the recital, but as actual natural history it is open to question. In every instance which I have observed, when a duck-hawk strikes, its claws are driven in and remain there. Usually victim and aggressor come to earth together, or the hawk releases his grip just before reaching the ground. Even over water I've seen the pursuer hang on with the spray flying about him till the quarry's struggles lessened and the hawk carried it off. It is true duck-hawks will harry flocks of small birds, sandpipers, blackbirds, etc., seize one after the other and squeeze and drop them, but no large victim I have examined showed any raking slashes, simply round wounds where the hawk's sharp nails had entered. Part of the duck-hawk's Latin name, peregrinus, meaning wandering, is something of a misnomer, although the genus, with slight geographical difference in coloration, is cosmopolitan. Our native birds have a strong predilection for certain areas, returning year after year to the same locality. In winter they follow migrating shorebirds some distance south, doubtless finding open hunting easiest. And one day I've counted 8 wings flying south along the beach before an October nor'western. Courage is largely a matter of physical condition. If the heart is strong and functioning properly, you have it. Man's primitive instincts still are sufficiently in the ascendant to make us admire bravery even in a pirate, while utterly contemptuous toward cowardice. Frequently our attitude toward the latter should be one of pity. While that strange inconsistent reasoning still applied by many when considering certain ethics, even a coward despises a coward. The duck-hawk epitomizes courage, speed, fearlessness. Although we know he is a freebooter, running down and capturing birds as large as, yes, larger than himself, even the swift carrier pigeons falling before his whirling onslaught, although we find remains of many friendly and beneficent species scattered among his eyrie. Do we drag out a gun and drop him among his victims? We do not. We regret that he is such a ruthless killer, and let it go at that. His dashing prowess saves him from that fate, and yet his species is decreasing. Every year the number lessens. Last year I saw not one duck-hawk. To alter an erroneous belief which has been forming for generations is a long and difficult undertaking. Most farmers of this locality are sure the red-tailed hawk is a hen-hawk. I've tried to eradicate this notion, but with only partial success. Rarely an individual develops a fondness for poultry. Then, of course, it becomes necessary to destroy him. But the majority of red-tails live on humble game and eliminate many destructive forms of life. During mild winters a few hardy ones remain, and today, the 13th of December, although snow squalls and sunshine follow one another in extended areas of shadow and light across the valley, I hear the wild, shrill call of the red-tail. Most birds of prey can exist for a considerable period of time without food, but this hawk's indifference to hunger is phenomenal. One day last winter a pair of red-tails were attempting to catch a grouse. Working together they may accomplish this, although I have never seen it done. The quarry took refuge in brush under a steep cliff, and one of the pursuing hawks lit atop a hickory 600 feet from the house of a friend of mine. At the crack of my friend's rifle the bird fell, recovered, and flew off, both legs dangling. 6 weeks afterward that unfortunate bird was found half a mile away, near the road, and still alive. The hunger, cold, and pain it must have endured were too ghastly to think about. Even as I write this, there is a weak feeling in my amidships section at the mere recollection. Victims wounded by my own gun caused me to shelve it 30 years ago. The incident just related is not a cheerful one, but I speak of it for 2 reasons. First, in the hope that it may keep someone from destroying the next harmless hawk, Secondly, to prove what unbelievable courage and fortitude this form of life possesses. On a clear May morning I watched one of a pair, probably the male, who build their home every year in a nearby hemlock, start those wonderful sweeping circles. Up, up he went out of unaided eyesight, but still plainly visible through the glasses. For an hour and 10 minutes he wove those aerial spirals without moving a wing. 3. When emerald nubbins of wild cabbage push their way through brown April soil, a lithe ash-colored bird glides deliberately over ochre hillocks of bog-grass, quartering the ground as carefully as a well-trained hunting dog. Years ago this meadow yielded a fair amount of hay, but each season the water backed up farther and farther, till the ground became too soft for horses. If reclaimed land is not cut over regularly, the jungle soon seizes it. Today alders, white birches, elms, and maples are rapidly changing it to a tangled miniature forest. Every spring, one, sometimes two, pairs of marsh hawks successfully add to the barrier population, conditions for such consummation being particularly favorable. One small cleared spot near the center of the field is sufficiently elevated to be above water under normal conditions, but surrounded with marshy ground wet enough to prevent raids by foxes or coons. It is selected yearly for one of the nests. 2 or 3 days after the male's advent, an umber-brown female appears and goes directly to the site of last year's nest, the male hovering a few feet above while she inspects the premises. Sometimes she decides at once. Other years they both wander up and down the valley for a week, apparently uncertain where to settle. This is only one stratagem, however, for they invariably return to the familiar site, and both pitch into the home-building task wholeheartedly. A good foundation of small dead limbs and twigs is first put down, and then the living quarters of the nest, woven of coarse weathered grasses and reeds, a remarkably well put together structure for a hawk, most of this genus being rather careless home builders. Notwithstanding a generous wing area, the marsh hawks are rather slow flyers, lacking entirely the dash and speed of a Cooper or a sharp-shinned hawk. There are times, though, when the male, swinging in great semicircles, pauses at the top of his sweep, drops with a falcon speed, turns tail overhead, drops again, somersaults, and rises straight up under the push of the north wind, to repeat the ambitious ecstasy perhaps a dozen successive times. I stood on the little June bridge one keen April morning, with half a gale hurtling down the valley, watching this dizzy courting. Absolutely oblivious of my presence, the performer swept by within a few feet of me, repeatedly. His mate on a nearby fence rail was equally indifferent. She seemed to be aware of nothing in the world except her dashing lover. Some sweeps were made in silence, save for a swooshing sound of wings. Others terminated with a raucous "ka-ka-ka-ka-car." If you put that speed into hunting, old boy, nothing a wing could get away from you. I'm glad you don't, though. Mice and snakes, or even snips and snails and puppy dogs' tails, will make our friendship wax and grow. I suppose the marsh hawks caught some birds, but I never detected our valley hawks in the act. Redwings, kingbirds, and swallows regularly took their daily dozen in bluff attacks, but the harriers soon became accustomed to the bombardment, and paid no heed to whatever these attentions. When the young were hatched in early June, food in the vicinity had been well thinned out. While one parent remained near the nest, the other went on more extended scouting expeditions. A favorite hunting ground was on a hill a mile south, where an artificial trout pond supplied a bountiful spread of frogs. The guardian parent would see its returning mate long before I could, and with loud cries of welcome rise to meet the successful hunter. In July, when the youngsters had learned to use their wings, they were quick to imitate this maneuver. With 5 hungry, squealing, feathered babies circling wild around, there was pandemonium in the valley. Regular newspaper row, when newsboys fought for their papers. When close enough to make identification possible through the glasses, one found that mice, moles, snakes, or frogs were the provender distributed. No birds. In early September, the entire family gathered in circling conclave and discoursed with loud and insistent earnestness upon some important subject, probably their winter home, and then suddenly disappeared. I hope it will be in early spring. Mr. Circus's courtship makes an interesting and exciting moving picture. End of Chapter 2. Chapter 3 of Secrets of the Friendly Woods by Rex Brasher. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Br'er Grouse. The sun, penciled through the western oriel windows, moves slowly up the wall, and at 3:30 winks out. The shadow of Buffalo Mountain reaches across the valley, climbs the white birches, ascends East Mountain, transforming its snow-clad sides to dusky mauve. The narrowing ribbon of light above glows deep orange, tips the highest summits, and disappears. Expectantly we wait at the north window. Almost on the stroke of 5, hurtling forms emerge from the hemlock windbreak, shoot straight toward the house, swerve and alight among the orchard trees for their supper of apple buds. It is seldom a living form epitomizes so admirably its environment. Capable, strong, and hardy as the stern hills where it lives, this king of game birds will survive long after its more susceptible brothers have vanished. Only one combination of the elements is fatal. When deep snows become ice-covered, while birds are beneath, the feathered creatures perish. Fortunately, this catastrophe does not happen frequently. The man with a gun is not their worst enemy. Probably more grouse take the long trail in the first 3 weeks of their existence than in the entire following period. The art of repose has disappeared from modern life. The hope of recapturing some of it lured us to the spot in the Taconic Hills, and the quest has proved successful. Humanity, chattering like Otter Brook in spring flood, has dwindled to a minor note. Yes, of course there are times when the noise is renewed, but the road is rough. Only hardy spirits push their cars over it, and, oddly enough, most of these adventurers are congenial fellows who do not demand an incessantly audible vocabulary as a mark of friendship. Instead of tomcats stalking across backyard fences, I see a mother grouse leading a flock of youngsters over the road not 40 feet away. Instead of yowls from the aforesaid felines, I catch, perhaps, the stamp of a deer startled from the orchard when I open the window at night. Late March, and the age-old battle between snow and sun is on again. Hillsides change from white to gray as the southern sides of rock emerge. Patches of brown appear, last autumn's carpet of leaves, which has not yet melted into the soil. The boisterous month wanes, snowy areas lessen, and at midday the thin, steamy snow fog wraiths gather in depressions. Wavering April comes hesitatingly down the valley, and indefinite spots of white saxifrage, like ghosts of tiny snowdrifts, dot the open hill spaces. Then through the still warm air comes a sound as of distant blasting. The first booms have a distinct interval between them, but gradually the tempo increases to continuous notes which merge into a subdued roar. Br'er Grouse is sending a challenge and invitation abroad from the old hemlock log a few 100 feet west of the house. By synchronizing each advance with the drumming, for apparently the bird is deaf and blind during the performance, one may approach without much difficulty, and the stalking is well worth the effort. Careful now. He is just beyond that bunch of witch hazel. There he goes again, and we cover the last 10 yards to the red oak within 40 feet of him. When you hear the first note of resumption, peek around the trunk. There he is, erect as a mitred bishop, tail widespread and flattened on the log for support, ruffs half open, wings moving with increasing rapidity until at the apex they are merely a blur. Winter is slipping fast astern. Love is awakening, and this soft half-Syrian day hints that real spring is not far away on the weather bow. The drumming is repeated. 20 feet away, beneath a half-open frond of ferns, a female walks with hesitating steps. Apparently indifferent, like all her sex, She comes into the open, stopping frequently to pick up an imaginary titbit or to throw a dead leaf carelessly over her back. But indifference is a game which two can play, for King David on the log pays no attention to her advent until she is within 5 feet of his throne. He drums again, and in the middle of the rolling notes she jumps upon the log. Does he stop? He does not. The penetrating, muted tumult continues to the end, while the lady preens a wing, stops while running a primary through her bill, and looks at him in surprise. "My goodness, where did you come from? This is my boudoir, really. Rather an intrusion on your part." They are all touched with the same wand of dissimulation, bird, animal, or human. Now comes a change in the performance, given few of us to witness, and only when fate is unusually kind. His tail is raised from the log, extended to its fullest, his ruff spread almost in a circle, giving the illusion of a disembodied head. With tail and ruff nearly meeting, wings extended stiffly downward. He turns slowly around, like a mannequin on a pedestal. The exhibition of pomp, beauty, and pride, generously shown from all angles, is too much. The overawed and subdued lady succumbs. This imitation of a miniature turkey does not always follow the drumming. In fact, I have noted it but twice. The feathered little Don Juan sometimes is so puffed up with pride and excitement that he will strut his stuff before an unconcealed onlooker. Those fortunate enough to meet one so generously inclined will never forget the picture of pomposity and self-complacency paraded before his eyes. Among masters of word-painting, Lafcadio Hearn ranked high, although it is many years since I first read his Memory of Last Island. The extraordinary beauty of his concise descriptions is still vivid. There is more or less of an imitative streak in all of us. We unconsciously, perhaps, follow the style which appeals most strongly. What goes down on paper may be far removed from the master hand, but here and there we form words into a sentence which betrays us. After all, we are but imitators of those who have traveled ahead, with just a tiny leavening of originality. Here was one who seemed worthy of following, and then along came those blank moving picture captionists and knocked that soaring ambition into bits. No writer would dare start a paragraph today with the words, "Came the dawn." Well, that's just what happened one day in early April, and with the dawn came a smoke-filled valley. Compared with the holocaust which sweep the western and northern mountains of our country, these fires are minor affairs because conifers are isolated, and only among pines, spruces, and hemlocks do we get the terrible crown fires. Hereabout the fires generally are ground blazes, menacing only when they reach a mass of tie-mill slashings. They do damage enough, however. If brush or leaves have accumulated at the foot of a deciduous tree, flames will burn the bark deeply and kill the tree. Add destroyed grouse homes, scorched arbutus and other wildflower beds, and the price grows. At the foot of Preston Mountain the truck was waiting. Shovels, grub hooks, and buckets were thrown aboard. Not the least strenuous part of that wild day was the business of hanging on to the four-cylindered steed as it leaped ponderously from crag to crag, like a certain goat. Sitting nonchalantly on the driver's seat was my old friend Joe Chase, smoking his pipe and guiding that bucking bronco with the aplomb of a city chauffeur steering a Packard on a cement boulevard. Numerous tufts of hair sticking through holes cut in the felt held his hat on, a simple and convenient scheme, obviating a chin strap. "Ye gods!" exclaimed Bill, when an unusually stiff bump lifted us a foot. "Ditto," I remarked. "Save the buckets." The fire had been held to the southward of the Dover road, and our job was to keep it from running north and east. The lay of the land was favorable. We backfired along the edge of an open strip, and the draft from the main conflagration sucked our blaze inward. There was considerable green grass and areas comparatively free from leaves, so killing the outer rim of the backfire was not difficult. With a small wet cedar it was swiped out almost as fast as I could walk. In this half-mile patrol I found one grouse nest with 13 eggs. When the men came in toward noon, they reported finding and saving 3 more. A plot of arbutus gave me a lively 15 minutes, but finally was saved, only the edges scorched. By nightfall we had the flames under control, but not until nearly 8,000 acres had been burned over. All this because one man refused to sell a woodlot to another. There was no definite proof. There had been, I think we should have hanged the criminal. But that was the consensus of opinion, and these men belonged to a type which is seldom wrong. Slowly, with many stumblings, man climbs upward. Slowly is right. Else a thing masquerading in the guise of a man would not have destroyed so many wild lives because of spite toward a neighbor. A single burned grouse would have outweighed the paltry essence he might have called his soul, though in so defining it he would have been alone. Individuals of his grade would seem to possess no soul. The feverish restlessness permeating the world today would disappear if we could emulate the simplicity and straightforward lives of the woods people. In the long flight leading upwards, the step ahead is marked consideration. Some have their feet upon it, some have put it behind, but far too many are lagging. A backward glance shows such uncounted millions that the heart sinks, hope dims. Will they ever make the grade? Perhaps, we are learning, but a long interval of destruction may intervene. Suddenly, up through the forest gloaming, a partridge rose, and that urgent whirring startled our breath and checked our roaming. We stood and were still where the leaves were stirring. End of Chapter 3. Chapter 4 of Secrets of the Friendly Woods by Rex Brasher. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Tuff Triumvirate. 1. The receptacle where the least lovely kitchen tasks are performed stands against the north wall. Facing a blank space while cleaning up throws one's thoughts back where they don't belong. So a window 18 by 24 was cut through the wall and a pane of clear glass permanently fastened there. It changed more than the room inside. The cookie, of course, is normally good-natured. I shouldn't dare say anything else. But I caught her more than once, smiling rather pensively out of that aperture, in a way she had not smiled before it was put there. Within this frame are painted many pictures, each one a masterpiece. Sometimes they are changed often each day. The backdrop varies least. An upright dark green hemlock windbreak, the same through all seasons except in spring, when the green lightens a little or darkens when a storm is foot loose. The 100-foot space between changes with each day ticked from the calendar. Snows of March displaced by fainter imitations of saxifrage and bolder splashes of chadbush cream. Summer's infinite varieties of green, most difficult to catch with a brush, the exquisite shades of autumn, and elusive purple and browns of winter follow one another, exhibit their wonders, fade, and find heart anew. Along in February, if the snow chances to be deep, about 5 o'clock in the afternoon, you can almost set your watch by them, we watched the ruffed grouse shoot out of the evergreens, sweep down with curved wings past the house, and alight in the apple trees for their evening meal of buds. Individuals sometimes lose control, or forget to use their steering gear, for twice they have kept on coming until they plumped smack into the clapboards. Fortunately, neither was seriously hurt. One was knocked unconscious. I held him in my hand for 5 minutes before he revived. Coming to, he looked around inquiringly as though asking, "Where am I?" There was no doubt at all that the location was not desirable, for he left it in a flash. Some winters the first mate's longing for the white lights grows too intense to resist, and I become a real honest-to-goodness hermit. On one of these occasions, while making a pretense of washing the dishes, I am informed that I never have learned how, but really watching 6 grouse which were feeding on grain scattered just beyond the grape arbor and within 30 feet of the window, I saw one of the birds straighten up and turn its head rapidly from side to side. Vision uphill was obstructed by part of the house, but my curiosity was soon satisfied. A goshawk hit the bird with extended talons, claws wide apart, both rolling in a flurry of feathers over and over downhill. The hawk's claws evidently had not struck through to the body. He was striving for a death grip and trying to stun the grouse with blows of his bill. Grabbing a gun, I rushed to the rescue. Happily, the grouse's struggles had been sufficiently strenuous to hold off his antagonist, and at my entrance into the fracas, the hawk arose, flying directly toward me. Thinking he intended alighting on a post between, I withheld fire. Alas, he swung by within 20 feet, a splendid, fully grown, dark slate-blue bird. The rifle cracked. If it had only been a shotgun, but that perfect aerial machine disappeared on wings which whistled as he went into high. Meanwhile, the near victim had gathered himself together and hidden snugly in a rock crevice under the hemlocks. The other 5 all crowded under protective briars or small bushes, and it was fully 10 minutes before their courage returned. During that interval, they did not move even an eyelid. Frightened enough they were then, but life's hazards evidently are soon forgotten, for next day at the regular time all 6 were back eating supper nonchalantly. Though swift of wing, the goshawks lacked the accuracy of aim and persistency in pursuit exhibited by the noble hawks. Singularly enough, the youngsters with their brown backs and stripes below seemed to have more tenacity of purpose than the old ones. I saw one of these immature birds dive into a hawthorn bush after a rabbit. The branches were so thick that he could not reach the quarry, but he struck again and again, at each attack leaving a bunch of feathers hanging on the thorns. I walked toward the scene of action, but apparently the bird did not see me at all. Every sense seemed concentrated on the desire to kill. I was within 10 feet of him before he desisted, swinging off denuded of half his apparel. Bunny never made a move, either being paralyzed by fear or knowing that leaving that shelter with its thickly clustered spiked branches meant death. Fright had benumbed it so completely that though I reached down and stroked its ears and back, it did not move. Fear reacts among many forms of life in 2 directions, often as a protection, sometimes as a means of extinction. I've seen rabbits bolt like a brown streak for a hole and reach it. Others stop suddenly in the open and are easily captured by the pursuer. Nature is an impartial old dame, sometimes assisting the helpless, sometimes forgetting entirely and offering them up as a sacrifice to any rapacious pursuer which needs a meal. It is fortunate for the ruffed grouse that goshawks are not numerous, and that their winter visitations are infrequent. I've never seen more than 5 in a winter, and probably have seen the same bird more than once. And some cold seasons go by without a glimpse of one. If the snow is deep and soft, they catch very few grouse, for the pursued bird will dive into the white blanket, and once beneath its shelter, is safe. A hawk never attempts to go in after one. I was sitting one January day on the bank of a small tributary of the Androscoggin River in Maine, with my back against a friendly birch, idly puffing the old pipe and enjoying the comparatively warm sunshine. It had been a regular winter, steady cold and 3 feet of snow on the level, but that day the January thaw was on, and the temperature must have touched 40 degrees. A whir of wings broke my meditation. A grouse shot passed from behind, so close that the disturbed air fanned my cheek, and dove into the snow on the opposite bank. Mingling with the whir of its pinions came a thin whistling as a fine blue-gray form dashed in pursuit not 10 feet behind. The interval was enough, and the foiled pirate swung upward in a long curve, the sun glinting for an instant on its fierce ruby eye. No moving picture has ever thrilled me like the breathless action of that near drama. It happened years ago, but even now as I record the scene, a faint touch of the electric sensation reawakes. 2. As I was trying with a piece of nut meat to entice a chickadee to my finger, standing at the end of a short walk above the 10-foot stone wall east of the house, the black-capped atom flew under my hand, alighting on the rail, and there crouched motionless. The next instant a slim-pointed winged bird swept directly toward me through the apple boughs, and I met it with a side swipe of my hat. The blow did not knock it off its wing, but diverted its course to one side, and that chickadee's life was saved, at least for the moment. The enemy was a Cooper hawk, and a hungry one. What must have been a disconcerting incident, being slapped with a hat, did not scare it beyond the walnut tree scarce 50 feet away. A hurried entrance into the house, a grab at the .25 caliber. The upright form was still there when I peered out at the back door, and then it wasn't. 40 years have not diminished the hope that each time afield I shall see something new, learn a novel habit of a bird or animal, and that expectation is seldom disappointed. As the years roll by, this anticipation makes me reluctant to destroy any life, because from a dead thing we learn nothing, save anatomically. But I must admit a sense of satisfaction when I drop one of these arch villains. Civilized mankind makes premeditation a necessary preliminary to first-degree murder, and insists all accused shall have a trial. But when an individual runs amuck, shooting everyone in his path, we waive both the preliminary and the trial. Self-preservation demands that we destroy that particular brand of killer on the spot, and we proceed to do just that. Here before the bar we have a duplicate of the human maniac, a bird who loses all sense of restraint, and kills not for food, but for the delight it finds in slaughter. A regular feathered mink, but infinitely more harmful to the avian world, because it has wings of such power and speed that few escape. Among the numerous times I have seen the Cooper hawks strike, I recall only 3 instances when the attacked bird escaped. An intervening limb saved a robin. A pair of catbirds separated as the hawk dove, thereby diverting his aim. A meadowlark was driven into a grass tussock, and by some miracle slipped out beneath his talons, which evidently had not penetrated. The Cooper hawk has the most impetuous and accurate aim of all the small hawks. The duck hawk perhaps is his equal in accuracy, but I know of no other. Systematists have placed the Cooper among the ignoble hawks, as he lacks the extra tooth in the bill. That is all he does lack, though. In speed, courage, and fierceness he is the peer of many of the so-called noble birds. One spring I raised, with a brooder, some leghorn chicks. When they were about half grown I heard them one day talking excitedly behind the chicken house, and turning the corner I almost stepped on a Cooper hawk rapidly and efficiently, tearing one of them into small pieces. There's only one thing more of a fool than a chicken. Another one. There they stood, cheeping and peering at the anatomical exploitation of one of their number, within a foot of the dissector. Perhaps their lack of a real live mother deprived them of a proper terror of hawks. Young chicks, not artificially reared, certainly possess this fear, and all, whether reared naturally or incubatorially, refuse fox meat, though eager for any other kind. One hereditary instinct is passed on, while the other seems withheld. Mr. Whigham, Mr. Kellogg, and the Tennessee legislature, please note. 3. In habits, impetuosity, bloodthirst, in color, in fact in everything except size, the little sharp-shinned buccaneer is an exact replica of his relative, the Cooper. The superior size of the latter enables him to accomplish more destruction, but ounce for ounce there is little difference between the two villains. The Cooper prefers to stage his onslaught against domestic game in the open, depending upon celerity of attack to get away with the spoils before an onlooker can seize a weapon. Poultry farms without shrubbery suffer the most, and unceasing vigilance is necessary to prevent these twin bolts of blue-gray gathering in their daily quota of chicks. Foxes and some hawks are shrewd enough to refrain from hunting in the vicinity of their homes. Not so with the sharp-shinned. A pair will exterminate songbirds for a considerable area around the nesting site, and if they take up their abode nearby, You will have to get them, or they will destroy a large percentage of your feathered neighbors. Find the nest, get within gunshot, and do the deed." I hesitated long, and considered all sides of the question before advising the elimination of any life, but in the case of goshawks, cooperhawks, and the sharp-shinned, the judgment is against them. Every observer, as far as I know, upholds this decision. These 3 hawks literally are pirates of the air, regular winged Morgans, Teachus, and Kids among the defenseless wayfarers of the hills and valleys. But even the villain of a drama may have moments when the demon within prods, or rather spurs, him into an act which results beneficially. Watching a small bunch of friendly chickadees feeding on the porch one April day, I saw them all suddenly freeze. This capacity of theirs for recognizing an enemy is an interesting and remarkable faculty, and sudden cessation of motion always means enemy in sight. And there he was on the extreme tip of an apple-tree limb, a dark gray shrike. Now, as a rule, I let this fellow go, but I know if he got one of those chickadees he wouldn't stop there. It was a case of either chickadee or shrike, and if you're acquainted with birds at all, you know which one you like best. As I returned to the doorway with a rifle, a sharp-shinned hawk struck the shrike, and they both tumbled to the ground together. Abyssinian justice. The quality of mercy was not strained that time. I'll admit it was merely a postponement, for a week later the little conqueror and his consort were sought out. They had murdered my pet Phoebe, and the final act of their life drama was closed. Like the rest of us, the sharp-shinned hawks sometimes experience failure, though so seldom that the occasion results in surprise. In one instance it caused bewilderment. For 12 years I have tried by every known artifice to entice bluebirds into homes built for them. Promises of free rent, protection, abundant food have all been ignored. 3 years ago a pair inspected the Chestnut mansions manufactured from the natural tree, bark left on, interior carefully finished with a chisel. In fact, all modern improvements except steam heat. They stayed around 2 weeks, until I concluded they intended to take a lease. The captain of the outfit, do you know which one I mean, gave special attention to the grape arbor lure, going in and out dozens of times every day, and then just as I was sure the couple was signing on for the season, with that feminine inconsistency not confined to birds, away she went to an old dead poplar with a deserted Downey's home 12 feet up out in the open valley. And, of course, he had to trail after. No stamina. Here one day in May, while I was watching the courting gyrations of a marsh hawk, a sharp-shin dived past and struck at the male bluebird. His feet hit the branch, and his body knocked the intended victim over backward, thereby saving its life, for it recovered and found safety in the nest. Meanwhile, the little demon, scarcely larger than a robin, lit nearby and was in the act of launching at the bluebird's mate, when a pair of kingbirds tackled him with such vigor and determination that he actually cowered for a moment, the only time I have ever seen a hawk of this species exhibit the slightest fear. It may have been more surprise at the temerity of the flycatchers than fright. Anyway, they certainly had his number. Once a wing, with his superior speed, outdistanced his pursuers, but the kingbirds hung on and made it interesting for him as long as they could. End of Chapter 4. Chapter 5 of Secrets of the Friendly Woods by Rex Brasher. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. A Buffoon in Blue. It was late October, calm with a soft haze and transcendent peace which falls upon our hills in that supernatural month, a day when the spirit like a vision turns from cloud to forest, from changing tree to tree. I found a comfortable hemlock for a backrest, one of the small cañons near Chickadee Farm. This I utilized with the leisurely hope that a deer would wander down the runway, for a well-defined path had been trodden in the draw. A gray squirrel appeared suddenly from behind a whitewood, scampered around through the rustling carpet a while, and ascended to its nest in a red oak. Something was walking toward me. I heard the telltale scattering of crinkled leaves long before I could make out the identity of the traveler. Presently a pair of grouse appeared, strolling down the dried bed of the stream. They were not feeding, simply out for a walk, enjoying even as I the color, quiet, and glory of the hour. At intervals they paused, shook out their feathers, wigwagged their splendid tails sideways, and acted for all the world like leghorn hens. Opposite rose a sheer wall of haphazard rock 100 feet high, crowned with stunted yellow pine. A blue jay emerged from the evergreens and began to descend silently and erratically, a few feet at a jump. But halfway down he stopped on a limb facing the wall and gave tongue. There was no uncertainty in his method of imparting some important information to anyone within hearing. He spoke right out, withholding not a single thing that was on his mind. Slowly and carefully my field glasses were swung on the point of attack, and there it was, savage head just visible over an edge of rock, eyes a cold, yellowish agate gray, opening halfway, then closing to a mere slit, indicating that old busybody's scolding was getting beneath the skin. This eye flicker of impatience betrayed the enemy's presence. Without the binoculars' aid, I think I should not have discovered him. Even through the glasses, his body, with its red-brown spots, was invisible against the red-brown leaves. As in Alice in Wonderland, there it was, a cat's head planted on the ledge, and there it remained until I moved, when it disappeared as silently as a wood spirit. A motionless wildcat, crouched on a rock, is so admirably camouflaged that the human eye seldom detects it. In over 40 years afield I have discovered only this one, and my vision was directed to him by an excited jay, telling the forest all about it. If we judged by the color of his coat, we should not be apt to place the jay in his correct place among feathered folk of the woods. But watch his mannerisms, and the answer is easier, half-brother of the crow. Taxonomically, the evidence is clear. The same heavy, blunt, rounded bill, strong legs and feet, body skeleton almost similar, though of course much smaller. But anyone familiar with the independent rascal would not have to study his internal structure for proof of his relationship to the shrewd old crow. In one respect, at least, the jay is the more advanced. He is four-handed. Individual crows do store away food when they find a surplus, but providence is not universal among them, as it is with the blue jays. Near our home, in the foothills of the Berkshires, 2 or 3 pairs raise families every year. Here they remain throughout the seasons. In winter we feed them, together with other cold-weather birds, not only because their beautiful blue is a cheerful note against the snow, but also for the jaunty, indifferent air with which they play the game. One cold morning last year a large ear of corn hung temptingly in the grape arbor. In precisely 19 minutes every kernel, hundreds of kernels, had been carried away. How they pitched in! If birds perspire, that pair must have been ringing, notwithstanding 0 temperature. They worked as hard as Mark Twain's jay, which tried to fill the barn through a hole in the roof, until some of his mates, peeping in at the door, saw the acorns falling on the floor, hopped up into the trees, and gave him the laugh. These chaps of ours used more sense in storing their plunder than that benighted laborer. I'd been clearing out old dead chestnuts for years, and a few days after the incident of the corn, I felled a 10-inch tree that still had some bark clinging to the trunk. I always remove the bark, because the wood doesn't decay 1/10 so quickly if there's nothing to hold moisture. As I slid the axe lengthwise, out dropped several kernels of corn. Every chestnut cut down in that patch had 1 or more kernels tucked snugly away. I found some holes where small limbs had rotted away on live oaks and hickories. The nearest of these caches was 500 feet from the grape arbor. Of course, there is no way of proving that our jays had carried all these away. Sequestering a quarter of the lot meant miles of flying, no lazy bird's job. Some individuals of the human race like to assume the vestments and office of supreme judge over their wild kindred. Reams of printed testimony have appeared for and against any wild bird or animal unfortunate enough to have the spotlight of publicity flashed upon it. So it has come about at different times that the jay has been arraigned, and these printed words may start the argument anew. My only advantage, holding this brief, is that I am getting in the first word. When our biologists at Washington undertake the study of a phase of life, they do so without sentiment, and the facts they present are cold, inescapable conclusions from which there is no appeal. 3/4 of the jay's food, as examination of the stomach proves, consists of vegetable matter, nuts, acorns, and small wild fruits, hard-shelled beetles, about 4%, grasshoppers, moth and butterfly egg clusters, caterpillars, and minor insects, about 20%, leaving 1% for birds' eggs, frogs, small fish, mice, snakes, and salamanders. Here is the case in a concise judicial brief. Verdict for the prisoner without the jury leaving their seats. It is a safe rule to catalogue a loud talker among the bluffs and cowards. The jay would not be entitled to a nook in the hall of avifauna fame because of his courage, but that quality is not entirely lacking in his make-up. In some years the chickadees have called for their daily ration of suet as late as the middle of May. To supply this demand, a large piece of the delicacy was left in one of the cedar grape arbor posts. A pair of catbirds, which had preempted a homesite in the syringas nearby, developed a fondness for the dainty. Catbirds, of course, eat spiders, bugs, and other forms of insect life, but here was an addition to their menu in which I had never known them hitherto to indulge. Evidently it was a rare treat, for they guarded the titbit most assiduously. When a peering jay attempted to get a billful, there was trouble. With feathers puffed out so they appeared like two slate-colored balls, the catbirds gave hot chase. Combined they were too much for him, but the jay wasn't going to let this opportunity go. He slipped out of sight and waited until only one guardian was visible. Then he came like a whirlwind. Before the catbird's mate could answer the frantic calls for reinforcements and reach the scene of action, the jay had seized a chunk of the booty and disappeared. This campaign lasted over a week, until the last of the spoils had disappeared. The opening notes of battle never failed to call 2 interested observers to the window. I make no plea that the jay should be canonized among feathered saints. He has his faults, yes, some which reach the ultimate wrong, murder, but this blood lust is largely individual, and my belief is that only a small percentage gives way to it. Last spring, about the time shad bushes spread their tents of white against the pale green of early May, a pair of jays selected a small hemlock 75 feet west of the house and began home building. One line of approach was not visible from the porch where I eat, and they utilized it every time. Glasses were trained on the spot for minutes at a stretch, but the first glimpse would be of the bird at the nest with a billful of material. They slipped through shrubbery ways as silently and deftly as a fox through the brush. After the young were hatched, I cut away interfering branches and watched the parents push food down those yawning yellow throats. A large gray moth was brought frequently, and I saw one of the parents tear a tent caterpillar's nest to pieces. I'm almost certain that some of the inmates were fed to the youngsters, though the distance was too great for me to be sure of this, even with 6-power glasses. When the blue jay fledglings were still in the nest, many regular leaseholders of Chickadee Farm were building or had eggs in completed nests. A pair of chestnut-sided warblers were occupying the same briars in which they had resided the previous year. This was within 50 feet of the jay's home, and 25 feet from the southwest corner of our house. Chipping sparrows, Maryland yellowthroats, song sparrows, robins, phoebes, orioles, and catbirds were all busy with family cares. Now, just so long as the jays kept unobtrusively to the western approach, they were completely ignored. But once or twice they ventured into the apple trees. Instantly, vociferously, the allies gathered and chased the intruders away. Nor could I see that they had harmed a single home. Steal? Yes, but in the Code of the Wilds, stealing is not listed as a crime. Food is the finder's wherever he discovers it, and if the other fellow hasn't wit enough to secrete it effectively, That is his misfortune. Jays never become so tame as tree sparrows or as chickadees. Caution is so pronounced in some that they never come to the porch feeding tables. They perch in the nearby lilac bushes, watch the chickadees take a piece of suet, follow unobtrusively to see where it is hidden, and then quickly gobble it down, never making the slightest attempt to attack the smaller bird. In the jays, curiosity and teasing are strongly developed traits. Whenever you hear the alarm notes, which do not require much imagination to translate into "hey, hey, here," investigate the cause. It is often interesting, as I found it in the case of that wildcat. North of our house, about 50 feet, there are 2 young black walnut trees. When the nuts are nearly mature, red squirrels garner the harvest, carrying the large green husks with incredible ease along a snake fence to their cache in the hemlocks, each a miniature Hercules with the world in his teeth. While the squirrels are thus engaged in laying up the winter's provender, the blue jays bother them not at all. But let one of the rufous-coated imps slip along the grape arbor to the food shelf to steal a bit of the chickadee's suet, and the jays are after him on the instant, and they will hover over him, sweeping, swirling, and scolding, until he reaches his evergreen shelter. Sometimes the attack is carried on with such aplomb, aggressiveness, and determination that defense becomes imperative. To stop even for a second is a tactical error, for the booty will be snatched almost from between the squirrel's jaws. Many naturalists believe that birds and animals do not reason. John Burroughs, I think, was one of this group. Others are equally sure that they do. It seems to me this may remain always a debatable question because of the indefinite lines between instinct and reason. The blue jay's psychic capacity of distinguishing between kinds of food which the red squirrels were carrying, one they could not use and left alone, the other they wanted and went after, strikes me as being fairly close to reasoning. Here enters the personal element. Just where does reason start and instinct leave off? As with many other questions of life, the answer must be according to our individual point of view. I am not averse to admitting many of my wild-feathered and four-footed friends to the reasoning grade. When we consider dogs, there isn't a fragment of doubt. The jay's vocabulary is as distinctive as his dress. Most of our birds sing for a few weeks in the springtime, and are almost silent the remainder of the year. Not so Mr. Jay. He talks throughout the 12 months, and every day, too. It is not all conventional conversation, either. Run into a flock of jays baiting an owl or a hawk, and you will hear the choicest assortment of Billingsgate ever uttered in the woods. Swear? My word, no end. Their teasing sometimes turns out seriously. If you must tease, don't push it too far. Watch your victim's eyes. These begin to grow hard, and the eyelids narrow like the gunman's in the Western yarn. Forbear, or the same thing may happen to you which happened to one of a crowd of jays annoying a broad-tailed hawk last spring. The hawk struck, and a member of the gang was lugged off to provide dinner for voracious little broadtails. After listening to the raucous scolding cries, it is difficult to believe that the mellow bell-like pee-toe notes issues from the same throat. But it does, and it comes forth with a ventriloquist quality, producing an effect of distance, making the call seem half a mile away, when in fact it is uttered by a bird only a few yards off. Like the crow, the jay has a great capacity for mimicry. His imitation of the wild kee-o of the red-tailed hawk is perfect, and seldom fails to deceive me. When I hear it, my eyes involuntarily turn skyward, for the sight of this hawk's majestic circles against the heavens is always alluring. Facing the window where I write is a hollow apple tree with an aperture 8 inches across, about 10 feet from the ground. Every autumn a screech owl takes up his residence therein. Sometimes he stays but a few days, sometimes all winter, but I am never in doubt about his arrival, because 4 or 5 of my vociferous friends, the jays, advise me that the little midnight prowler has returned to occupy the premises. It is interesting to watch the air of utter indifference assumed by Mr. Yellow Eyes as he surveys the outlook, not bothering even to turn his head toward his aggressors. "Just wait until dark, you blue-coated ragamuffins," he seems to say. "Maybe I'll catch one of you asleep, and then—" The attack is pushed too far, he slips down into the hollow as quietly as a fade-out in a moving picture. When he vanishes, one of the boldest of his tormentors perches on the edge of the cavern for a moment and peers down, but there his courage stops. He ventures no farther. When you really want to observe happenings in the woods, put on inconspicuous clothes, select a likely location, sit down, and keep still. I was doing precisely that in late April, when a pair of jays alighted in an adjacent cedar. Usually you cannot keep still enough. They spot you almost every time. But the amorous urge seemed to dull the customary keenness of this particular pair, and apparently they did not know that I was watching. Could that series of soft musical notes come from the male's throat? It was almost unbelievable. Instead of the noisiest, most impudent creatures of the woods, he was now the epitome of alluring persuasiveness, a plain case of feathered Jekyll and Hyde. I've often wondered where our winter birds find haven when cold rain and sleet are abroad. One morning in late November, when a southerly gale was driving great slants of rain across the hills and through the valleys, I remembered a sledge and wedge which I had neglected to bring down from the woodlot. It happened I had been cutting under a cliff. Glancing up at the squall-swept surface, I detected a bit of blue, and there were 3 jays snuggled together in a niche 30 feet up, well out of reach of the most violent gust, as comfortable as 3 human beings in a warm house. There I left them, 3 rollicking buccaneers tamed by the elements to a condition in which they didn't even care to scold me. After all, isn't it those who, like ancient Greeks, take life's storm and sunshine with a laugh that we most admire? End of Chapter 5. Chapter 6 of Secrets of the Friendly Woods by Rex Brasher. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Philohela. Nearly a century ago, according to our friend J. Cypress, Jr., that queer animal the Reformer was browsing around. True, the reformation undertaken in this instance was a minor one, revising unworthy names. We wish with all our hearts that the large and blatant company of holier-than-thous would confine their attention to matters equally unimportant. White, in his Natural History of Selborne, calls the woodcock Scolopax simply. Latham dubs him Scolopax rusticola. Wilson christens him Scolopax minor. This is probably the true patronymic of the American bird, as he is a minor, a smaller animal than that described by the ornithologists of the Old World. If you go to Delmonico's to eat out of season, you will ask for la beccasse, and be mistaken for a Frenchman, and get a private room, and so perhaps avoid detection. Sportsmen generally among themselves talk of killing cock, but if they meet an old woman in the woods and want information where to beat, they ask her if she has seen any blind snipes. A straggling boy will pocket your 6pence and send you up a rugged mountain on whose either side he will assure you there are plenty of woodcocks, and you will go and find after a weary travel that you have had your tramp after red-headed woodpeckers. Seeing, therefore, that the nomenclature is uncertain and sometimes undignified, reducing a much-valued visitor to the caste of a common dunghill chanticleer, and moreover, as this is the age of reform of unworthy names, we propose to introduce to our readers the excellent subject of this article by his true title of Scolopax minor. They have undoubtedly derived their family name from their cry, their Scolopaxian, "Goodbye, I'm off." Anatomize the word, and take out the vowels which, when a bird is in a hurry, cannot be expected to have time put in. Try it. Sklup. The trail is out, but is not the body of the sound perfect? They are the only people who come to us with long bills, whom we are particularly anxious to see. If any boy of theirs comes to us and says, 'Here is your bill, sir,' kick him out. We do not. But as we have the right to pick our friends, so we have to pick our birds. Our enemy would say, 'The first to the pocket, the last to the bone.'" Since William B. Hawes wrote his quaint and inimitable sketches, from one of which the above is quoted, our little brown-backed friend, the woodcock, has been more fortunate than many in the matter of names. His has been changed only once, and he is now Philohela, appropriate enough, meaning a lover of bogs, and less sketchy than Hawes' definition of scolopax. March shook her skirts viciously, releasing from the folds a 3-day blizzard which gave all animate things a terrific shaking up. The last pine in the valley, a splendid tree nearly 2 feet through, was twisted off and fell, fortunately away from the old farmhouse. 2 willows measured their length across the road, and many chestnuts dead on the stump found a last resting place. An enormous mass of rock, water, and frost had stealthily, for uncounted years, been separating from the main hill, and at last accomplished the task, and added another jumble of rocks to those already below the cliff. And the birds, I don't like to think of them. The wild Nimrod of the storm was running amuck, waving Azrael on in his destruction. He made a thorough job of it. For weeks afterward I found their starved forms under bushes, in the woodshed, hidden in rock crevices, even on the porch. Damn the villain! If it had been possible to grab the reaper by his indefinite neck, I should have wrung it surely. 48 hours later I was seated on the porch in a chair, tilted against the clapboards, smoking contemplatively in the warm April dusk. Above the undulating blur of hills hung the stars, softly luminous through a gossamer haze. A gentle air wakened faint murmurs among the lily twigs, and wandered off. From the meadows the clear call of peepers. What is there in the simple notes so alluring? They are as characteristic of early spring, as much a part of it, as the changing willows or tessellated cottonwoods. The little frogs paused in that strange unanimous cessation of calls which comes now and then in their chorus, and into the interval drifted a single scape, then another, scarcely audible from the northern edge of the meadow. The woodcock, aristocrat of migrating game birds, had returned. It was good to hear again his sclop, or scape, whichever you choose. Either is as near as letters can describe the sound. The note is similar to the nighthawk's, and I remember my complete mystification in my early bird studying days when I heard the call of a nighthawk in March on Long Island. I knew the aerial gymnast did not get in that month, and searched the sky for the daring adventurer. No sight of him there. Moreover, the cry seemed to come from the ground. The puzzle soon was solved. As I advanced, a woodcock flushed and gyrated against the evening light, filling the dusk with continuous scapes. Years ago, that stretch of country north of Jamaica, Long Island, now called Forest Hill Park, was an unfrequented spot where my first enthusiastic delvings into the mysteries of wildlife were made. Scattered through the terminal ridge of the island's backbone were many tiny swales perfectly adapted to woodcock occupation, and I soon made the interesting discovery that the birds realized its advantages and were utilizing them. The knowledge that here, within the limits of a great city like Brooklyn, numbers of these fine birds followed through a large part of their life cycle unmolested, and, as far as I could tell, unknown save to me, was a secret I held close to my juvenile soul. Those were momentous days, when my first gun was aimed where it should not have been. The primitive was in the ascendant, but fortunately it soon succumbed in the battle with sentiment. Here in this favored spot I learned that the woodcock did not confine themselves to bogs. True, the indications of their presence were more noticeable in the moist areas, drill holes and splatter, but during the day they always retired to the dry ridges, forming down among crinkled last year's leaves. Walk boldly through these upland covers, and probably you would fail to flush a single bird. Change tactics, move more slowly, pausing now and then if you suspect one was close by, and their natural nervousness would make them think they were watched, and soon the strain, proving too great, was released by flight. An odd reflex, exactly the opposite of that of nearly all other forms of wildlife. By far the larger number of our furred and feathered friends are more excited by motion than the lack of it. The woodcock menu is about 98% angleworm, obtained by a census of touch and hearing. The extremity of the bird's long bill is prehensile, and so sensitive that it does not make the mistake of dragging out a root instead of a worm. Sight not being required for sustenance, the eyes are placed far back in the head, giving an owlish and extremely odd expression. With bill burrowed to the forehead in mud, birds with eyes forward would be seriously at a disadvantage, especially should an enemy approach from the rear. Arranged as the woodcock's eyes are, they could detect a prowling minx or fox in ample time for escape. While this posterior location of the eyes increases the woodcock's range of vision on the ground, it is sometimes a handicap in flight. One October day a bird jumped a little way ahead. The gun flashed, but at that instant Big Eyes hit a birch limb and fell. Knowing it was not hit by shot, I picked it up in surprise and saw there was no indication of a wound on the soft brown plumage. As I held it, the eyes opened suddenly, only stunned. Searching my pockets, I found a bit of wire, twisted a couple of loose turns around one foot, and released the bird. In the light of present-day proof, through bird banding, that many individuals return to the same locality year after year, there is nothing very remarkable in the fact that on the 14th of May of the succeeding year I flushed that bird from her family of 4 youngsters. But it was a pleased and astonished boy who held one of the downy chaps in his hand. They were the cutest little imps imaginable, with their short bills and their bodies boldly striped lengthwise with black and pale yellow. They resembled exaggerated juvenile spotted sandpipers more than their mother. Here I saw something that I was destined to note, but once more, in the following 35 years. Replacing the little tyke among the leaves, I moved backward step by step, testing the distance I could detect its small form amidst the protecting environment. 10 feet, still clearly evident if I kept my eyes on it, but if my gaze shifted even a foot outside, I had difficulty in recovering the motionless fuzzy ball. 15 feet, uncertain, and softly as an owl, the mother glided in, lit directly over her precious baby, and gathering him between her long toes, was off. Back she came after the others, as silently as a spirit bird, transporting them to safety. At least as far as I was concerned, I pursued them no farther. The day's happenings had filled the cup of interest to the brim. Balboa, when he scanned the illimitable Pacific, had nothing on me. Few had thrown themselves more wholeheartedly into conservation and protection of wildlife than Hornaday, but when he said the woodcock is extinct, I am afraid fear of what might happen was father to the statement. One trait which will postpone that evil day is the extraordinary wariness which seems to possess all woodcocks in certain years. Some autumns they will lie right under a dog's nose, refusing to fly until they are kicked out. Other times it is impossible to get within gunshot. This was notably so in the autumn of 1924. One of my hunting friends tells me he once scared over a dozen in a patch about an acre in extent, and did not get a shot at one. Why are they plain dumb sometimes, and at others wilder than grouse who've been hunted a month? Perhaps there is a kind of avian radio in the air. Figure it out if you can. It's beyond me. Most of us who wander afield are familiar with the ecstatic flight song of the ovenbird, but how many have witnessed nocturnal hieroglyphics traced by Philohela against the dim evening sky? The sun was gone. A clear white light, austere as that of a Vestal Virgin's lamp, filled the west. In the east, dusky steel blue merged into soft ashes of roses. Over the blurred distant hemlocks and nearby alders hung the pale segment of a new April moon. A sleepy white crown greeted it with muted notes. "Oh dear, dear, dear," as though complaining about its disturbed rest. Where Otter Run joins the main brook, I sat down on a maple trunk, whose shallow roots in the tenuous ground had yielded to a norther the previous autumn, beneath 3 white birches. Although my resting place was only a few hundred yards from the house, part of the trip was such hard going through the bogs as to make it seem 3 times the distance. Fortunately, black flies were quiescent, and mosquitoes not numerous. A woodcock was nearby, unseen, but betrayed by soft minor wheel whistlings. Would he come into the open space in front? He would, and did. For 10 minutes I watched a series of gyrations, pigeon wings, and all the theorems of calculus combined, scarcely credible in a bird usually so staid and dignified. Up he went in spirals, twittering and cheeping, for 50 or 60 feet, at first clearly observable in the moonlight, gradually disappearing as he ascended, until only semi-musical notes told that he was still aloft. Down he came, pinions whirring, in a regular nighthawk dive, without the boom, sweeping off horizontally in a long slant to the ground. This side-slip brought him to rest on a tussock not 15 feet away, and I knew the primary reason for these wild stunts was somewhere near. There he strutted, tail perpendicular, head thrown back, bill buried in the breast feathers, scaping every half-minute or so, his whole body jerking spasmodically at each call. I've no doubt his sweetheart thought him marvelous, perhaps looked into his eyes even as females of a higher order have been known to look, murmuring, "Wonderful." While woodcock prefer clean alder and willow besprinkled meadows, they are by no means confined to such localities. I have frequently flushed them on hillsides from the tiny hollowed-out form, where evidently they had spent the night. A simple tavern open to the stars and all wandering night winds. If such an elevated spot is selected as a nesting site, it is always within a short distance of proper feeding grounds, a hill lake or swamp to which the birds fly for meals. Although gentle, quiet, unassuming, and given strictly to minding their own business, humanity et al., please note, they possess that most admirable of human virtues, high courage to an astonishing degree. Over Dover way a pair selected a spot directly between sled tracks along which logs were hauled to the mill. The first time a pair of monsters dragging a tremendous juggernaut appeared, the female flew from her eggs, but thereafter, when the horses passed on each side, she merely crouched a little lower, and sat tight while the swaying load rumbled overhead. How many humans would remain quiet if Ajax suddenly appeared driving a pair of brontosauruses ahead of a gargantuan sled loaded with full-length trees? Would you crouch in silence and let this awesome cavalcade thunder above you? Maybe, but it's doubtful. To me there has always been an air of mystery about the woodcock, and I never see one without hoping I may pick up something new in his life history. Among materializations of this hope is the September day when I flushed 23 birds amid yaupon trees in sandy ground near Beaufort, North Carolina. What they were doing in that unsuitable environment I cannot imagine any more than I can understand their presence in the salt meadows near Cape Romaine, where the sloop's main boom, sweeping through the grass, scared them out as we shot down Ramshorn Creek. It wouldn't surprise me to see them sauntering around on the lawn, but there's one place in which I really do not like to view them, and that's a glass case. Among the incidents in Mr. and Mrs. Big Eye's career, which is still shrouded in mystery, is their method of feeding their young. Do they accomplish it a la hummingbird, push the wiggling worm down the youngster's throat, or spread the dainty enticingly on a sedge tablecloth? Maybe I'll find them at breakfast some day, before the final curtain falls. I can discover no information about their table manners in any of our etiquette or bird books. Can you? End of Chapter 6. Chapter 7 of The Secrets of the Friendly Woods, by Rex Brasher. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chuck Luck. 100 feet south of the porch, pale November sun shines on withered corn stalks in the garden. Of course they should have been cleared away, and that 1/6 of an acre manicured against next spring. All farm magazines devote pages every year to instructions as to how just this should be done, and somehow I didn't get around to it. Even bean poles stood in the ground. That is the last word in careless gardening. Autumn had drifted in, calm, serene, beautiful. The days claimed and held me through hours of glowing forest color and skies of fathomless cobalt. Work? To the donjon keep with the villain, ball and chain on each leg. Far better to lie a hammock and, leaning, listen to the listless crickets telling their old-time legend o'er again. In desultory bird songs from the thickets, mingling regrets and warblings in one strain. When the previous owner reclaimed this bit of wild woodland, he built a 3-foot stone wall along the southerly edge, hauled loads of earth, and with his horses put in many days of hard labor. He believed he was making a garden. When I supplemented his efforts by blasting out a 6-foot ledge in one corner, I had the same idea in mind. Well, that little cleared oasis isn't a garden. It's a battlefield, and every spring hostilities are renewed. There is a wire fence around it, which helps a little. In this wild country, with insistent nature forever poking her fingers against the back door, you couldn't raise a flagpole without a chicken wire guard. Park the brush hook, sickle or hoe for a day, and the prolific old dame is right after any open space. The fence is covered now with masses of wild clematis, the seed puffs of soft gray 3 inches across. Wild raspberry canes have intertwined with complete indifference to the amount of work required to get them out, and quack grass. But enough. If I got started on that, this yarn would be devoted to ravings against that archdemon amongst weeds. The fight against rampant vegetation has been hard, but not entirely unsuccessful. A vigorous use of the hoe kept the enemy semi-subdued. The real scrap was with animated life, particularly as represented by members of the marmot family, in other words, HSM woodchuck. You won't have to do much mental exercise as to what HSM stands for, not if you have a garden where woodchucks abound. I am of a complacent makeup and recognize the rights of other forms of life besides the human animal to live and enjoy themselves. On 135 acres of prime A1 rock, woodland, and meadow, the original inhabitants can do as they please. Foxes have left their footprints across the front doorstep. Skunks have wandered casually around the porch. The broad wings of eagles have thrown their shadows on the roof. A pair of red-tailed hawks have built each spring a few 100 feet northwest of the house without any protest from me. Even with the villains among birds and animals, I have leaned backward on the side of consideration. But when one of them destroys in a single night as many beans as would keep 2 of us supplied for a week, then patience expires. The primitive instinct of self-preservation becomes dominant, and the fight is on. Carefully erected defenses, with wire turned out 6 inches at the bottom, proved effective for 2 years. I listened with tolerant smile to tales of devastated gardens. Nothing to it, just lack of simple precautions, etc. But mid-June of the 3rd year, one morning when I went down to give the rows of growing vegetables the regular daily once-over, the blow fell, some solid crack, too. All young cabbages neatly beheaded, many not eaten, simply nipped off, tips laid alongside. Beans likewise, but the tender shoots devoured. Carrots ditto, although not entirely destroyed. An hour spent with a sickle outside the fence revealed no hole, not a single break where a chuck could enter, yet the villain was a woodchuck. Footprints in the soft soil revealed his identity plainly. A steel trap is double distilled anathema. If I lived in the far north, where tampering with another's trap lines meant a bullet, my existence would be abruptly terminated, for I take every trap I find. Shooting a fox or other animal is bad enough, but at least the end is swift. Catching it by the feet, holding it through bitter cold for hours, yes, days, is unthinkable. Only the human animal could practice such cruelty. If there is a future existence, as far as my observation goes, most animals are more entitled to immortality than many human atoms, and I believe that some of these same atoms will have a large host of ghosts to confront them when they go west. Here was an emergency. If the destruction were not stopped, our vegetable supply would be limited, and we are particularly fond of garden truck. If a snare were fastened to a tall stick so it could be seen above the bushes, I could watch it virtually all the time, thus preventing needless suffering on the part of a victim. This was done. The loop carefully slipped down into a hole on the north hillside, where the expected wretch probably was lying doggo. The peeled wand stood upright all day. Either he was not in the hole, or understood what that bit of line meant. At dusk it was still there, and next morning the battlefield was strewn with more wreckage. All right. In the matter of brains, Mr. Woodchuck is considerably below the raccoon, and that grade of mentality wasn't going to get to windward of me. With pipe and a .25 caliber rifle, I sat down alongside a convenient rock. In about half an hour the wire began to shake. Ah, that's where you get under, is it? Wrong guess. Up it came, foot over foot, as dexterously as a seasoned A.B., teetered a moment on top, changed ends, and backed down. When hard-pressed, woodchucks will climb. I've seen them frequently among the limbs of low-lying branches, but they are of the ground, and 99 times out of 100 make for a hole when threatened. Here was an individual capable of scaling wire fences, a feat I had never witnessed before. Extra rewards are supposed to come to those who are more clever than their fellows. In this instance it didn't work out. If this chuck, propped up on his haunches, surveying the prospect for an enemy before devastating the layout below, had been just an ornery chuck who tried to dig his way under the fence and failed, probably he would be on top of the earth now instead of under it. The triple role of judge, jury, and executioner is not pleasant to one who loves the children of the wilds, especially when a creature is simply following the path of instinct and age-old habit. But there are times when it just cannot be evaded. This was one. Here and there old Dame Nature has dropped in amongst her family a murderer, a killer who destroys for the fierce delight he finds in slaying. When a sharp-shinned hawk grabs Mother Phoebe from the front porch, lugging the ruffled mass of feathers off to her abattoir, the case is black enough. But add to this the atrocity of striking down one of your favorite song sparrows and leaving it fatally wounded, and the indictment is complete without further argument. That bandit must be extirpated. Now, I don't mean to place woodchucks in this class. Maybe dragging real double-dyed villains into the picture is a sort of weak-kneed attempt to give the prosecuting attorney a little extra morale, a kind of smoke-screen to cover the thin streak of remorse always following the act of blotting out sun and stars for any living being. Biologists tell us that the introduction of these fierce destroyers into the scheme of things is necessary in order to keep down superabundant life. In view of the fact that tragedy stalks close on the trail of all animated things, the statement loses force. A power omnipotent enough to bring the universe into being and run it surely could have arranged limited reproduction instead of encouraging overwhelming numbers kept within bounds by continuous destruction through more voracious forms. This may be questioning the wisdom of omnipotence, but a supreme being formerly supposed to frown darkly and direct destroying rays at any human entity who dared question his methods is no longer de rigueur. It is even possible that he is not averse to being questioned, and although there may not be an answer, there is no evidence that interrogation hurts his pride. Br'er Chuck is a conventional, staid old customer. His feeding schedule is about the same as ours, morning, noon, and evening. Along in the autumn, when laying on extra fat to carry him through the winter, he feeds any old time and becomes so stout that at a little distance Bow can be distinguished from stern only by noting the direction in which he is going. Being a disciple of Lucullus may have its gastronomic advantages, but when a distended organ handicaps a fellow's speed enough to enable an enemy to catch him before the subway of safety is reached, of what avail the satisfied appetite? After imitating the amiable Roman gentleman until it is physically impossible to crowd another atom of food within, Mr. Chuck stretches out on the warm rocks and nods in the drowsy October sunshine. At such times he is shrewd enough to maintain close to a haven into which he jumps at the first sign of danger, emitting a sharp whistle as he disappears. Matter of fact, as he is in most habits, an element of mystery enters into his home building. 2 years ago a cellar was dug in the hillside near the small town of Macedonia, a mile or so south of Chickadee Valley. A woodchuck burrow was encountered near the east side. 25 feet in, it still continued, 30, 40. The final measurement showed that gallery over 55 feet in length, turning around rocks, through sand, loam, and gravel. What becomes of the excavated earth? At the entrance was perhaps a wheelbarrow load, at the exit only a trowelful. There are two possible answers to this query. The earth is either carried out and scattered some distance from the entrance, or packed along the sides as the burrow is dug. The latter seems most likely, but how the creatures do it is puzzling. Try digging a hole with a crowbar and see how far you'll get. Then imagine driving a 5-inch hole 55 feet, compressing the earth along the sides. There is a catch in it somewhere. Of course, the length of this tunnel was extraordinary, the average being from 5 to 10 feet. Many casual and some keen naturalists tell us the chuck always has an exit to his den which he uses to escape when attacked below ground. Suppose we get at the facts here. When Bethman Holloweg asked if England considered the terrible results to follow her entry into the World War, Earl Grey answered, "Fear of consequences never deterred England from upholding her solemn word." I believe Grey's ethics correct. So here goes. In fields or ground where digging is easy, it is true that there is sometimes one or more exits, but in woods or in these rocky hillsides it is not so. I found many burrows with entrances only, and I'm convinced that extra openings are added solely for Mr. Chuck to duck into when outside, or for ventilation. There's no animal in this part of New England with sufficient temerity to tackle a woodchuck in his den. I once saw a chuck dive to safety a few jumps ahead of a mink. Did the pursuer go in after him? He did not, just sniffed disappointedly at the mouth of the hole, and went on. Sometimes foxes make half-hearted attempts to dig woodchucks out, but a single instance where this has been accomplished successfully has never come under my observation. I'm aware that I stand virtually alone on this point, but that cannot be helped. We must record happenings as we see them. It must be understood that I refer to full-grown animals. Neither mink nor weasel would hesitate for one instant to tackle a young woodchuck. While iconoclastic bricks are in the air, let's shy one at another myth. In a beauty show, the chuck would take no prize. Nevertheless, the unprepossessing old chap owns the distinction of being the only animal in North America who has had a day named after him. On the 2nd of February he is supposed to awaken, and if the sun is out, so he sees his shadow, he goes back into his hole for 40 days more of winter sleep. Now, however did that story originate? If you awakened from sound slumber and found sunshine and warmth without, naturally you would conclude spring has arrived, or is just around the corner. You'd sit up and wait for it, wouldn't you? That's just plain sense. Yet this ancient tale persists year after year with its illogical cross-eyed conclusion. Vulcan, or whoever had the contract for building these tectonic hills, celebrated the completion of the job by having a game of jackstraws with the rocks, leaving them in every conceivable formation. One day I stepped around the end of an upright slab of granite north of the house and cornered old Graybeard in the apex of an acute triangle, my boots forming the base. He rose on his haunches, was 2 feet from the ground to his wrinkled nose, and faced me courageously. "Old Bean, I've long wanted a chance like this, Will you behave and listen a few minutes?" He chattered his teeth, the two big front ones a pair of wicked chisels. "All right, make it snappy. I just wish to remark that as long as you keep on this side of the fence and away from the garden, you and I shall be friends. But, yes, I know, if I go nosing around down there I'll get caught in one of those iron things with snapping jaws. So you're the muttonhead who murdered my brother. You look as if you had some kindness, but I guess not. No soul." He rechattered his jaws and continued, "Say, who owns this country, anyway? You came here a few years ago and started telling us who have been around for thousands of years just what we must or must not do. Wrong, old gray top. Your original habitat was the woods. Why don't you stay there instead of edging out into the fields? You weren't bothered much by man as long as you remained in the forest. Besides, I have to live as well as you, and all I'm asking for is 1/6 of an acre. 1/6 of an acre. Do you get that? You can have all the rest of the world as far as I'm concerned, so I don't see where you have any legitimate growl coming. How about it? North of the house or fight?" "All right, north of the house goes. Just step to one side so I can pass you. My hind legs are tired. Thank you. Goodbye." I saw him several days later feeding on a viburnum root, surrounded by an inquisitive group of leghorns. "Making out pretty well, aren't you? Don't find it much of a hardship to live up to your agreement? You'd better continue to keep it, too, or I'll sick my fighting hummingbird on you." "Don't do that. I'm afraid of him. Yes, I'm making out all right. I really don't need young cabbages, but we think we want everything we're told we can't have. Any of you two-legged animals like that?" "All of us." 2 years ago, last spring, a little black and white dog adrift in town placed its paws on the running board of a friend's car, pleading to be taken in. It was. The rescuer possessed 3 dogs, so ownership was transferred to me. Pal never would take a blue ribbon, because it would be difficult to select any particular breed under which to enter her. 3 strains are evident: Coach, Wired Hair, and Fox Terrier. Perhaps an expert could detect half a dozen more. However, lack of pedigree didn't prevent Pal's entrance into the game of keeping down the woodchuck population with wholehearted alacrity and enthusiasm. A dog soon learns respect for the courage behind that pair of daggers at the front of a chuck's jaw, but usually gains his experience at the cost of many severe slashes. Some dogs never learn, and return from a chuck fight looking as though someone had spilled a can of vermilion paint over them. Pal developed a technique of attack entirely original, and in 20 recorded battles, and probably as many more fought in the woods, she received only 2 small bites. Her first 2 victims were small, their existence terminated by shaking. The third affray was with the reprobate who specialized in green peas. We caught him one morning in the act of hauling down 5-foot vines with his front paws, so he could get at the tender tips. To and fro over his back went the dog, the chuck trying to follow with his head, but his reactions were too slow. In a few minutes these attempts to follow Pal's rapid movements seemed to confuse him. The dog sensed this instantly as she went over, reached for, and got the fatal neck hold. As long as there is the slightest resistance, Pal attacks furiously, but when she realizes her antagonist has taken the count, interest ceases, and she pays no more attention than a clod of earth. Old Graybeard disappeared before the dog's advent. What happened to him I do not know. If he went out on the long trail, it was none of my doing. I'm rather glad he is gone, for if the game old boy had chanced to mix it with Pal, the scrap would have been a fierce one. Besides, I had promised that patriarch he would not be molested. And am I not my dog's keeper? End of Chapter 7. Chapter 8 of Secrets of the Friendly Woods by Rex Brasher. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Coons of Chestnut Caverns. A year or so ago, a light snowfall came in the first part of December, and I went up to see if regular tenants had taken possession of the chestnuts. They had. The telltale blanket showed a maze of tracks which at a cursory glance seemed to indicate a full regiment of raccoons abroad beneath that tree the night before. 30 minutes of careful examination revealed the fact that this intricate lacery had been made by 5, certainly by not more than 7, of the nocturnal prowlers. There were the slender prints, nearly 2 inches long, of the older ones intertwined with slightly smaller footprints of maturing children. Red and gray squirrel tracks were numerous. The old homestead evidently was occupied by a variety of lodgers. Here there is missing text. Attracted me when 13 years ago we left urban ways, forever I hope, for this spot about 80 miles north of New York City. The first spring of our residence here showed many live chestnut trees, but the blight had even then got its stranglehold upon them all. No other trees in our New England forests possess so many good points. For general usefulness they stand alone. Split rails of chestnut endure 50 years. A natural, not sawed stick set in the ground outlasts all others, possibly excepting cedar. To allow these hundreds of dying trees to go completely to waste would not do, so the bid of one of my neighbors was accepted, and a 54-inch circular saw soon shaped them into ties and general lumber. "I see you haven't cut that big fellow, 1/4 of a mile west of the house," I remarked, "nor that old giant to the northward." "Too big to handle?" "Never saw a tree in this country too big for me to tackle," he replied. "Those 2 old boys are hollow, and though they measure 6 feet through, I wouldn't get enough out of either to pay for the work." Unlike other deciduous trees, a large chestnut will stand for many years after life has left it. The roots decay very slowly, perhaps because of the presence of tannic acid in unusual quantity. The supporting network of another tree will disintegrate in a year or 2, and the trunk will fall. It was 8 years ago that the last nut dropped. The final leaf fluttered earthward, and life departed from our chestnut trees, except in the small shoots. But my 2 old warriors still lift sturdy arms, and probably they will defy the elements for years to come. I hope so, for they are the 2 largest and most popular apartment houses on the place. The hill tree stands on what was a buckwheat field many years ago. The flat rock on which the grain was threshed with flails is still above ground, but birches have overgrown the area. Looking at it now, it is difficult to understand how a plow ever turned that soil. A little distance southward a brook wanders among the rocks, turning and tumbling, always intent upon finding the easiest way downhill. Nearby is one of those old stone fences, 4 feet at the bottom, 3 feet wide at the top, and 3 feet high, both sides and top slanting inward. The average of these stone walls lasts perhaps 75 years. This one has already reached that age, and looks good for another century. The men who built these rough monuments are gone. Here about 50 cents a rod was what they received, and one of the last of the genus told me that it was considered nothing remarkable to lay up 8 rods a day. A subsequent visit to my little tenants made it clear to me that the old folks had driven the youngsters out, or had allowed them to depart of their own volition. One new home was established in a dying maple some distance away, another on a rocky ledge. Next, old Barface himself was dismissed, and evidently was informed in no uncertain terms that a long journey would safeguard his health. His trail led to a cave in a jumbled group of rocks over a mile away. A most important event in the old lady's life wasn't far off, and she didn't intend taking chances with the father's jealousy. Positive evidence of the male's cannibalistic propensity is wanting, but twice I have found young dead from exposure at the foot of trees where probably they have been evicted from the nest by the father. Along about the time Old Soul crossed the equator, 4 little blind raccoons wiggled around on their comfortably lined bed in the cavern's warm darkness. The winter days of alternating hibernation and awakening were past for the mother. 4 long-nosed and insistent mouths meant that plenty of food was necessary for her if they were to be well nourished. An early April moon hung low above the serrated hemlocks in the southwestern sky. a thin segment giving barely enough light to show a strong, sturdy figure making its way to the ground. Cleverly as she handled her feet, the task was not an easy one, for in places the rough bark was gone, and the smooth, weather-seasoned wood offered slight foothold. After many twistings, the ground was reached, and the feel of good solid earth impelled her to give 2 or 3 exuberant jumps, exactly like a cat at play. The winter had been mild, with little snow. The nearby brook gossiped in undertones instead of roaring noisily as when it has to carry a foot or 2 of melted snow from the hills. From the little meadow above came no shrill piping of peepers, but half a mile below, in the broad marsh between the main ridges, she could just detect their high, insistent notes. That was a long journey. She would defer it until later, and tonight would see what could be found near her home. She paused, sniffing eagerly among the leaves. Then her powerful front paws went into action. Grass, earth, and leaves flew aside, and an inch-long fat white grub was seized in the sharp little teeth, carried to the brook, carefully washed, soused again and again in the cold water, then, and not until then, daintily eaten. It was but a morsel, and eased the hollow feeling in her stomach not at all. A dozen more grubs were excavated, the same rinsing given every one. Then she transferred her attention to the banks of the stream. Here she found better hunting. Several newts and salamanders were dug out of their hiding places under stones. By the time the moon had set, a satisfactory amount of food had been stowed away, and she started for home. Absolute silence met her return. Young as the children were, the instinct to utter no sound or make any movement, until no danger threatened, was fully developed. Only when she nuzzled their tiny forms did they emit little squeals of greeting, quickly squirming around until each was in a position to get a late dinner or an extra early breakfast. Food became more abundant as spring advanced, but it was more difficult to catch. Constant persecution will teach meadow mice, chipmunks, and even salamanders wariness, and before long the supplies of the neighborhood had dwindled or disappeared ere old Ma Coon could pounce on them. So one night in May, when the full moon was abroad, she determined to forage and make a trip to the lower meadow, where she still heard the high-pitched notes of the peepers. She did not intend to waste time hunting them, too small, but mingled with their call was a deeper one, the full bass boom of the bullfrog. The hind legs of one of these fellows would furnish as much meat as 20 peepers, so why bother with the small fry? A quarter of a mile through the woods, then she stepped out into the open road, sniffing the air a moment for possible danger. The lustrous moonlight revealed her compact body, covered with long, dusky brown hair, balanced by a tail nearly as long, its black rings clearly visible. The head, long and pointed and keen as a fox's, the characteristic black mask across the eyes, gave her an air of sagacity, shrewdness, and capacity to take care of herself in an emergency. Nor are these phrenological indications misleading. The raccoon is an individual, a personality among the folk of the wilds. She was not a graceful walker. Each foot came down flat, a plantigrade. Now, running, that's a different thing. The tips of her feet hit the ground so lightly they scarcely seemed to touch at all, and carried her forward a thing of light grace and speed. In movement, one moment a miniature bear, the next an exaggerated mink. The bank on one side of the stream through the meadow was high and firm. On the other it was virtually no bank at all, the water spreading out over the flats. Several old rail-lined fences extended into these acres of black mud and crossed the brook. Jumping to the top of a rail, where it left the dry ground, the coon ambled along. Where this fence reached the brook, one end of the lower rail had slipped out of the post socket and lay slanting in the water. Here she crouched, her nose almost submerged. In the lore of the wilds, a correct synonym for patience would be life. This wise old mother knew that many a time when younger she had been too impetuous. Minutes went by. The shadows of nearby willows enveloped her. It would have taken a keen eye to see anything alive on that log, half hidden in the water. An hour passed, when suddenly 2 great protruding eyes appeared within 4 inches of her nose. A motion swift as conjuring, and a gleaming bit of white rose from the water, landing on the far bank. The dark bulk of the raccoon followed so quickly that the two bodies hit the ground almost simultaneously. Had the frog lit on his feet, he might have had a slight chance, but falling on his back as he did, he was doomed. One snap, and life for him was over. The front and hind legs were carefully detached, the rest of the body discarded. After the inevitable washing, both front and one hind leg were eaten on the spot, and with the other tidbit in her teeth, Ma Coon started for home. The extreme caution of the blind stage of the youngsters had disappeared. They had learned to recognize the sound of her mother's claws as she ascended. Tonight, two eager faces in the doorway greeted her return with impatient little mews, half grunt, half squeal. The attempt of the most impetuous to seize the food was met promptly with a sharp cuff. The morsel was equally divided, and a portion given to each. It was by no means a full meal for those growing young appetites, but a pleasant wrangle over the bones diverted the babies' attention from their stomachs. With all the intensity and passion of four little bear cubs, they fought over the prize until they chewed it up. Imperceptibly at first, then more rapidly, the summer nights lengthened, and Mother Coon undertook the task of teaching the young ones to leave the nest and descend to the ground. This, too, called for patience, and although occasionally she lost it and boxed the laggard's ears, on the whole she showed more forbearance than many a human parent. Early one morning the most venturesome infant crawled out and started down backward, while the anxious mother watched from a nearby crotch. Absence of bark prevented the little explorer from getting a real hold with his tiny claws, but he succeeded. Coon see, coon do. The rest tumbled out, one after another. Still under parental direction, the youngsters began foraging for themselves. One of them, coming suddenly upon a water snake in a shallow pool, frightened the brown-ringed reptile into releasing a trout held crosswise in its jaws. Searching little pools isolated by receding waters of the brook, they caught numbers of maroon trout and chub. Now, if you are a fisherman, do not go up in the air over this. Those fish would have died anyway. This easy living aroused in one an independent spirit which led him to occupy a little cave some distance from his birthplace, and to start a home of his own. Another, following the main valley brook one night, reached a place on the bank where the grass had been trampled flat, a spot strewn with trout heads and tails. Here was a find, and the discoverer proceeded to enjoy it voraciously. It was one of the times when she regretted the necessity of washing every bit. The performance cramped her speed, and she may have neglected one or two pieces. Turning in the midst of her gargantuan gorging, she saw two intense eyes watching from the alders. In the next instant, a regular old grandfather coon advanced from the thicket. "Don't you know you're poaching?" "What's that?" she asked. "You're stealing my fish. I live in that chestnut over there on the edge of the marsh, and this is part of my hunting ground. Get off, and don't ever come back, you thief." Argument with a gentleman of his weight and belligerence would have resulted only in a good licking, so she hesitated not at the order. She retreated swiftly, nor paused to give even a tiny snarl. However, the meeting proved of value, inasmuch as she learned one of the primary lessons of the wild. You must find an unoccupied hunting area, post it as yours, and keep intruders off. Grandfather may have had his suspicions, but the young lady did not know that this spread had been provided by a pair of otters for their own family. What they discarded were merely the crumbs from the table of the Lord of Streams. Otter and Grandfather Coon may have met at the banquet board, but there had been no serious difference, for the impressionable ground showed no marks of battle. Courageous but no fool is the little brother to the bear. Grandfather was far too wise to mix matters with such an antagonist. A single blow from an otter's front paws would have been enough. Grandfather Coon's residence in the fantastic old Chestnut is about 500 feet north of our house. It has been occupied, more or less regularly, for 12 years by gray squirrels and raccoons. Each family, apparently, keeps to its own side of the tree, and they get along in friendly fashion. It overlooks the full sweep of lowlands clear to Peaked Mountain, 2 miles north, and therefore is a favorite tearing spot for many kinds of hawks. I've seen redtails frequently leave its lofty limbs in slanting drop for woodchuck or rabbit. Marsh hawks and crows use it to rest upon, and occasionally that gray terror, the goshawk, perches on one of its arms. One morning, while breakfasting and watching the slow November dawn coming through the southeastern notch, I saw a large bird appear in the wan light. It was almost as large as a crow, but with glimpses of white. It approached, flying across the lower edge of the orchard, with the characteristic dipping flight of the woodpecker. My thoughts flashed back 30 years to the austere winter hills of Maine. A pileated woodpecker! Alighting on one of the hollow limbs of the old chestnut, he sounded his rat-tat-tat. How it did ring across the valley! Grandfather Coon was accustomed to the tiny taps of downy and hairy woodpeckers, but this machine-gun volley was something new. Through the field glasses I saw the astonished face at the opening, looking at the splendid drummer only a few feet away. "Surprised you, old fellow, did he? You're not alone. 3 decades is a long span, but that jaunty red cockaded head brought back the spruce pinnacles against the wide blue. Smoke is motionless above the cabin chimney as the tingling frost suffused air. The hoarse call of moose and the tamarack, when the hills of Maine held my willing feet. Most of the men and dogs who tramp these woods at night have gone west. My neighbors are given to following the golden rule. They know I do not want them to destroy wildlife on these acres, so they abstain. Hereabout it is many years since raccoons have been treed by dogs, then shot out of limbs. Relieved of this menace, they have thrived, and I believe right now there are as many of the little semi-rascals as the land will support. How sport enters this game of galloping over rocks for the best part of the night for a chance to blow a harmless bunch of fur off of the treetops, I cannot and never could comprehend. I went coon hunting once, in the hills by the little town of Alfred, Maine. 4 of us, a dog also, circled around until 2 in the morning, before the pup came to anchor at the foot of an old stump some 30 feet tall in a small clearing. Here's a big one, no doubt of that. We could easily discern its elephantine contour against the starlit sky. We've only got this 22 caliber pistol. If I miss him, he'll go into the brook and we'll lose him. I'll go back and get the gun, said Frank. Back he went, 2 miles, whilst we important Nimrods, the dog also, talked loudly beneath the roost for over an hour. Then the armed traveler returned. Here, put that lantern behind something. The gun was aimed, exploded. The animal came clawing to the ground. Don't let him kill the dog. Hey, look out, you banged my foot. Stomp on his head. The deed was done. The lantern brought. A large Maltese tame wildcat lay at rest within the circle of light. Well, I'll be dashed. And I hope I shall be if I ever go on another coon hunt. The first was plenty, then it will be the last. Although the tenants of our 2 old monarchs and their confrères are no longer persecuted by the most serious enemy, dog and man, they are not immune to the bright face of danger besetting all wild life. Half a mile west of the hill tree, the brook wanders along for 100 yards for almost a level stretch. Fine oaks and whitewoods arch thickly overhead, dimming the light. Wild ginger carpets the black damp earth, a place of cool shadows where I always linger. On one of the sandy banks built in the spring by the torrential brook, I came upon evidence of a terrific battle. The signs were not difficult to read. A mink and a coon had engaged in a furious struggle, and neither had won, because both combatants had lacked the strength to bring it to a lethal conclusion. The raccoon's capacity to stand off one of these bloodthirsty demons is due not only to his dauntless courage, but also to the fact that he fights primarily with his head, supplemented by teeth and claws. He is a furred strategist. His long, rough, hairy coat is unquestionably an important factor in his favor, preventing an antagonist from easily gaining the fatal throat hold. I tracked the plucky old fellow to a hollow poplar, offered my silent admiration in the hope of a speedy recovery. The mink had holed up a little way below. I gave him slight sympathy and hoped old Azrael would get him. widely divergent wishes presented to animals whose characteristics were accidents of birth. Looked at in this light, it seems scarcely fair, but it's the way we're built. We cannot help hating a gratuitous murder or admiring courage. Out of 7 dead weasels, 2 were killed by raccoons. The antipathy between weasel and coon is strong, and although I've never seen an actual contest, it is probable, I think, that the coon makes short work of this miniature edition of the larger brown-coated relative, the mink. As September drifted into the haunted month, Grandfather Coon became restless, wandering farther afield. One early October night, his impatient feet carried him several miles from home territory. Padding along in a woodchuck trail, he came suddenly to the bank of a small lake, where the warm glow of sunrise was reflected. A ruby, set in yellow birch-tree gold. A convenient fallen trunk, extending obliquely into the water, offered his favorite resting place. Crouching low, his pointed nose an inch above the surface, he waited for breakfast. The warm sun felt comfortable. The night had been close to frost. His eyes narrowed, almost sleep. Then convulsively he drove sharp claws of all 4 feet into the tree trunk. Something was yanking with persistent force at the end of his tail. He turned his head and looked into the cold, malignant eyes of a monstrous snapping turtle. His hind legs were slipping, and then the terrific strain was so suddenly released that the reaction almost threw him into the water on the other side. The merciless jaws that never release a hold had caught only the fur, not the end of his vertebrae, while his fascinated eyes still stared into the basilisk orb set in that horrific head. He saw a black hole appear in the forehead, heard the sharp snap of a rifle. His gaze shifted to the figure standing close by in the brush. That was not an enemy. He had seen a similar shape many times near the old home tree, and walking back along the trunk he moved sedately past, and was saluted with a wave of the hand. Lucky for you, old boy, that he had you only by the hair, and twice fortunate for me that I happened to be right here. For the past 3 years that arch-devil has destroyed everything in this lake that he could get that vice of his on. He ate up a whole family of wood ducks this spring, mother, father, and all the babies. Thanks for your assistance as bait, good hunting to you, and a pleasant ramble. Although dead, these 2 majestic sentinels of a dying race still rear their gaunt limbs aloft, loving the wide air and sky too well to hear the call of earth. There they are, one on the hill, one overlooking the intervale, their bare arms outstretched against the gray December clouds, their stout sides still protecting the lodgers, who never will be compelled to appeal to the courts about increased rents, while I am their landlord. End of Chapter 8. Chapter 9 of Secrets of the Friendly Woods by Rex Brasher. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Dr. Logcock and Company. 1. The tree trunks forming the old corduroy tote road were almost gone. In fact, where the ground was moist, they had melted entirely into the earth. In some stretches, tamaracks, birches, or alders encroached so thickly it required a woodsman's eye to trace the path. The men who had built and hauled lumber over its corrugated surface were gone, too. A hardy, indomitable race who handled that tool of empire, the axe, as easily as most of their descendants would a willow slip. October had just released the hand of September, but already in these northern Maine ways the frost spirit had been abroad a night, painting the deciduous trees along the edges of the lake with varying soft, exquisite shades, pale yellow, deep topaz, mauves, and browns, with touches of Tyrian purple. Any of the boys left who put this way through, Joe? No. What's become of Bronson? I'll show you a little farther on. As we turned north, the forest changed from a tapestry of many colors to the deep, dark, alluring green of spruces. Ahead loomed one of the few remaining giant pines, and coming abreast of it, I saw a small rough wooden cross at its broad base. 4 of us came in last year. Bronson was one of the guides. When we reached camp about dusk, he wasn't with us. I went back and found him against this tree, gone out as quietly as a falling leaf. The man whose name was cut in rude letters on the crossed sticks was as much a part of the forest as the tree beneath which he rested. His spirit did not have to break through the four walls of a room to start on the long trail, but slipped off on the great adventure among the things he had loved beyond all else. Somehow I think the long traverse would lose some of its uncertainty if we could all start that way. We reached the little cabin tucked away in the wilderness, 15 miles from anywhere, a little after noon. Anywhere, did I say? Not exactly that, for around it were clustered many of the real things that lured us back year after year. Joe looked about him. Everything seems to be here except a wash basin. You start the grub, and I'll soon fix that. Joe took his axe, a short-handled, keen-edged 3-pound instrument, cut off a section of spruce from one of the logs stacked against the side, hollowed it out neatly, and in 10 minutes came in with a good substitute for the lost article. Fascinated, I watched him handle that tool. Every stroke counted, not one was wasted. There were many generations of pioneers behind his dexterous hand. We spent the afternoon scouting for moose signs. Joe was a hunter and probably always would be one, although even in him I detected, each time we met, a distinct lessening of the destructive tendency. For me, the glamour of the chase had long since faded. Camera, brush, and vision had displaced deadly weapons. Years ago, a wounded grouse had swung my wavering allegiance to the gun away from it forever. I hope the pain and question in his splendid eyes as they closed will not haunt me on the other side of the divide. Against the clear amber light, the trees deepened from dusky green to black. In the pale rose of the southeast, Sirius twinkled, a blue-white diamond calling into light the lesser suns of rubies and sapphires. Then into that quiet came the clear, poignant notes of a white throat repeating, as in a dream, "Oh, clear, 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 clear," its crystal spring song intensifying rather than breaking the silence, so utterly did it merge into the spirit of the hour. Long after the platinum segment of the western moon had dropped behind the spruce spires, we sat smoking, talking of many things, by the beguiling campfire. At last the Sandman's touch prevailed. We wet down the fire and turned in. In more ways than one, dreams are inexplicable phenomena, and not the least mysterious thing about them is the fact that they often have no connection with recent thoughts or happenings. In the heart of the Maine woods, why should I have dreamed that I was jumping from tree to tree in the depths of an African jungle, pursued by guerrillas shooting at me with automatics? The guerrillas, apparently, could not climb, while I was an adept at that game. My yells for help disturbed Joe, for as I awoke and saw him looking at me in the dim light, the sharp barks of the pistols continued. "That's only old Log Roller tapping outside for breakfast." "Tapping? You call that tapping?" "Sure. We fed him last winter, and he's back again. Forgot to tack up the chunk of suet I lugged in for him. It's daylight. Might as well turn out now we're awake." When I opened the door and stepped out into the clear morning air, the pileated woodpecker flew from the cabin to a dead tree, sidled around back of it, peering inquisitively, his flaming head a vivid patch against the black-green conifers. When Joe appeared with the suet, the bird came fearlessly around into full view. Whether he recognized the difference between us, I don't know, but I'm inclined to think it was the glimpse of food which emboldened him. Joe placed it under an old wire kitchen sieve, while the woodpecker, 10 feet above his head on the tree, watched as he fastened it securely and stepped back several paces. Then, backing down in a series of short hops, the bird went after breakfast like an April bear, tearing out chunks as large as could be dragged between the interstices of the screen. In a few minutes his mate appeared, but she was much shyer, refusing to participate in the spread until we had retreated some distance. "That's a 3-pound piece of fat, and you can see how long it would last without the wire. Last year I had 5 pounds. It was later than this, along in November, and the camp robbers had come down from the north. Between them they cleaned it up in 3 days. They'd have done better than that if the last of it hadn't been hard to get out through the grating." Our supply lasted, owing to the absence of Whiskey Johnny, one of the many names for our friend the camp robber, over a week. The morning after it was finished, I trailed the mail until noon. During the 5 hours, he lit on 163 different trees. Most food was obtained from the dead gray or white birches, two short-lived species of trees. On one stump he remained 16 minutes, tearing off large sections of decayed wood and flaying the papery bark off in sheets. It was a thorough, workmanlike job of demolition. When it was completed, the ground was littered with the debris for yards around. It was absorbing to watch this black, white, and red dynamo in action, and although he was but a dozen feet above the earth, there would frequently be a sliver of bark in the air before the preceding one had reached the ground. Sound evergreens attracted slight attention, as they offered few lurking places for grubs. Two spruces hit by lightning and rapidly dying were carefully inspected on the sides where the bark had been slivered off in long strips. Small acorns, eaten whole, rounded out the insectivorous menu. About noon he disappeared into the large-mouthed cavity of a poplar, perhaps for his midday siesta, for in the half-hour I waited he did not venture a single inquisitive peek. In flight the logcock is a conspicuous figure, the white markings beneath flashing in regular sequence as the wings open on the rise, close on the drop of the characteristic looping woodpecker curves. Sometimes these parabolas are accentuated almost to segments of circles, and accompanied by chuckling calls. Imagination does not require much encouragement to picture an old hen flying overhead. All of us experience some happenings which linger so tenaciously in our subconscious minds that they recur again and again without effort of memory to revive them. Moonlight on the sea, glory of autumn, starshine on quiet waters, it may be any of these. Among such recollections is a glimpse of the pileated imperial brother, the ivory-billed woodpecker. It was 30 years ago. We were driving down the Frederica River, the sloop logging a good 8 knots before a stiff nor'wester, about 15 miles north of Brunswick, Georgia. Pointing to starboard, the mate exclaimed, "Look at that funny crow." I looked. Swinging in regulation undulating curves, not 50 feet from the sloop's bow, passed an ivory bill, so close I could even distinguish its sex, a male. Knowing that ivory bills usually travel in pairs, I watched eagerly for his mate, but we were an eighth of a mile beyond before she followed. The ladies of the romantic 90s were cautious. 2. The red-headed woodpecker is one of the first birds I learned to identify, and odd as it may seem, it was not the easy task it would be under normal conditions. I was about 10 years old when I saw a bird with carmine head, white below and with black wings, sweeping out from a tree-top, catching insects on the wing, returning from each foray to the same perch. A flycatcher, of course, but an exhaustive study of Wilson's and Nuttall's ornithologies, the only 2 bird books I possessed at the time, revealed no red-headed flycatcher. The next sight of the bird, this time on a tree trunk, cleared the puzzling situation. In the long interval between, I have watched and admired the easy assurance, playfulness, and D'Artagnan air of this rollicking blade, wearing so jauntily the colors of his country. He, like many others of our brightly colored birds, has had to struggle against not only natural forces of destruction, but the more deadly one of the slowly dying unjust prejudice clustered around the banner of "shoot him down." Next time the opportunity offers, listen to one of the redhead's family conferences, when the brown youngsters are old enough to participate. The arguments, loud calls, uncensored remarks, and unwoodpecker-like notes would shame a democratic convention. The hearer might even imagine Dawes was addressing the Senate. Watch a pair harry a red squirrel who perhaps had broken into their cache of beechnuts. The opening attack is delivered in apparent anger, but as the melee progresses, gradually changes into its real character of pure teasing. The birds generally come out top dog, driving the would-be thief into hiding, and although my sympathies usually are with the under canine, in this case the flaunting flag of victory waved above the miscreant wins my unqualified approval. I've seen a pair isolate one of the rufous-coated imps on top of a fence-post and bedevil him so persistently that he fairly frothed at the mouth, thereby releasing some of the beechnuts stowed in his pouch. These one of the aggressors carried off and hid. The other, meanwhile, continued the attack until the freebooter gave up the rest of the loot. Most of the genus possess a limited vocabulary, but the redhead voices an astounding array of chirps, cheeps, and rough notes, including a wick-up, 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 shorter but resembling the flicker's rolling call. Like his relative, the ant-eating woodpecker of the West, who digs holes in an old stump and fills them with acorns, sometimes traveling miles to obtain the oak seed, the redhead stuffs surplus food away in crannies. He lacks the instinct to chisel holes for these stores, always stowing them in some natural cavity. But the tendency toward four-handedness is there. I've frequently found large black beetles with all legs carefully removed, under crannies of bark, secreted probably at a time when the guardian angel of Coleoptera may have been wandering off in the woods somewhere, watching the nymphs and fawns at play. The utter indifference of the stronger forms of life toward the suffering and torture of the weaker ones is not conducive of a belief that the monitor of all cares very much whether or not they suffer. Most members of the woodpecker family remain on the home ground throughout the year, or migrate locally if driven to it by extreme cold or lack of food. Two exceptions are the redhead and the flicker. An old maple stands in the meadow about 600 feet from the house. I watched flickers bound south through the narrow defile of our valley in late September, and it seemed every one of them lit on that isolated tree. Migrating sharp-shinned hawks always headed for it too, and many an interesting game of hide-and-seek was played in the branches with flickers in the role of evader. Down shot the little murderer. Round the limb slipped the woodpecker. Swinging in an upward arc, the pursuer hurtled back, executing a series of short-arm dives, but I've never seen one succeed in catching the pursued one. The most persistent aggressors were the young hawks, the slate-colored elders merely making a single swoop, then shooting off and onward. If education is the capacity to apply experience, here was an example. The old birds probably had made the attempt many times in their youth, unsuccessfully, and wasted no time now on a futile pursuit. It was evident the woodpeckers knew they were safe as long as they remained in the tree and dodged. Rarely one attempted escape by flight. If it did so, that was the end. The feathered demon had it before it was fairly clear of the leaves. The New York Conservation Commission has established a zone from Canada to Long Island Sound, along the eastern edge of New York State, against advancing hordes of the gypsy moth. The men who have been through this section of the Taconic Hills are fine upstanding Americans who take a personal interest and examine every tree as carefully as though it were their own. The moth usually lays the fatal egg cluster on the trunk, but it may be deposited in a crevice or limb impossible to see from the ground. In the descriptive circular, no mention is made of assistance, but Messrs. Downy and Harry are on the job continually. The downy woodpecker is such a confiding little fellow that nearly every move of his has been watched and recorded. Big brother Harry is rare, and comes to the suet counter only when regular food is scarce. Anything written of him is equally applicable to his lesser confrere. In a dead golden sweet apple tree, over 1/8 of a mile west of the house, a pair of hairy woodpeckers have raised a family every year for the last 6 years. This tree is one of a number which formed an orchard near the original farmhouse. None would guess a home had ever been there. All remnants, even the foundation, have disappeared, and the gaunt old trees are rapidly following. Seated under a cluster of small maples, one day in early May, I watched the interesting courting antics of the pair. The jaunty male's favorite position was one in which he appeared to be almost standing on his tail. With bill upright, wings thrown forward, and tail widespread, he repeated over and over what was undoubtedly intended for a love song, a series of notes divided between chuckles and whistles. But the strangest, most mystifying performance was a series of backward drops on the underside of a limb, inclined about 45 degrees. Newton would have received here no assistance toward discovery of his famous law. Indeed, the law was apparently suspended for the particular benefit of Mr. Harry while these Houdini antics were executed. Why didn't the little acrobat fall when he released his claws? Studying his movements carefully through the binoculars, I came to the conclusion that at the instant of releasing his grip, he jerked his body toward the limb with sufficient impetus to catch the bark 6 inches or so below. As usual, the lady pretended indifference. Assumed reluctance was ever a potent feminine wile. Wherein she differed not at all, it will hardly do to say with other two-legged ladies, so we'll compromise on just females. She threw him a side glance now and then, but even that meager encouragement was sufficient to stir him to additional activity. The couple successfully evaded the dangers of wood and field with the youngsters, although my fighting dog may have been helpful in this, for with wild short barks she chased a weasel away from the vicinity. This bundle of energy and viciousness is the worst enemy the woodpeckers have here. They are not afraid of black snakes, and attacked courageously whenever one was encountered. Moreover, they usually select a home tree too large for reptiles to climb. One day in November, after the leaves had relinquished their hold on all but oak branches, I began getting down next winter's wood. A Harry lit on a dead tree near by, peering inquisitively at me around the trunk. It suddenly occurred to me the day was too warm for chopping, so I dropped the axe on top of a butt, filled the pipe, and spent the next 4 hours playing Follow My Leader. That fellow lit on 218 different trees, an average of nearly 1 a minute. The longest time he remained on one tree was 7 minutes. This was a dead chestnut with most of the bark still adhering. By far the larger proportion of the trees were old chestnuts, and under their loosely attached covering he found most successful hunting. Rough bark species were preferred. Chestnuts, oaks, old maples, and hickories, about in the order named. Smooth-barked ones received little notice. He did not alight on a single white wood, although they were common. Birches were included occasionally, and in one of these clumps he had a short argument with a chickadee whose territory he was invading. The chickadee is small, but he has plenty of pluck, and he informed Mr. Red Topknot that his society was not desired. Being a gentleman, the Harry readily acceded to the request to move on. If this average held good, it meant he inspected something like 550 trees in a 10-hour working day, a conservative estimate, for during spring and summer his time card would show a much longer day. His capacity for locating a grub was not always accurate. Many borings I examined enter the burrow above the grub, but near enough so the extensive barbed tongue could gather in the dainty. Very rarely the first attempt would miss the mark entirely, starting below or at one side. Sometimes the mistake was discovered coincident with the removal of the first few chips. At others, the false hole was driven quite deeply before correction. Just how the birds locate these hidden delicacies is uncertain. Naturally, the first conclusion is that the sense of hearing is the primary factor. This is probably correct, although some of the curled ugly specimens I have brought to light on January days looked and acted too frozen for even the slightest movement. Young smooth-bark hickories honeycombed within half an inch of the surface by borers, which entered from the ground were not drilled by the woodpeckers. Many of these internally riddled trees were cut down in the nest vicinity, and the birds either had not known they held food, or had considered the effort necessary to penetrate the tough wood too onerous. Their attachment to the home location was remarkable and unique among birds of this vicinity. I doubt if they ever ventured more than a mile from this remnant of an orchard. North of these old trees an oblong open field was convenient for felling next year's wood supply. On my trips up there, one of the pair never failed to be nearby. Several times the male's curiosity conquered his aloofness, and he ventured within 30 feet, answering each axe blow with his sharp queak for minutes at a time. Maybe he thought I was some strange kind of woodpecker intruding upon his premises, and that swinging axe a novel form of bill. I recall very few times, no matter what the season, that I did not see or hear a woodpecker somewhere in the vicinity. Their fondness for drumming on a hollow limb is not confined to the spring months. While writing this, on a rather mild day in the latter part of December, I was called outside to identify a series of singular bell-like notes. They were made by Harry's smaller brother, Downy, who had discovered a sounding board with a peculiar resonance, producing a metallic scale similar to that of the tree toad, but higher. Members of this genus have been accused of many crimes, from eating corn to murdering the young of other species, and with a persistency reminiscent of the Dark Ages, these erroneous beliefs continue to revive. As a family, the woodpeckers are among man's most valuable allies in keeping insect enemies in subjection. So-called facts must always be qualified by the grade of intellect presenting them. Running down unfriendly criticisms of these birds to their source will usually reveal their basis rest on poor observation or biased judgment. Consideration for all forms of wildlife is gradually extending toward the high plane it eventually will obtain in man's evolution. End of Chapter 9. Chapter 10 of Secrets of the Friendly Woods by Rex Brasher. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Red and Gray. Do you live here all winter alone is a frequent query. I live here the year round, but not alone. My side partner attends to household affairs, and Mr. and Mrs. Sciurus usually occupy the north wing. Mr. and Mrs. who? Sciurus. What an odd name. It fits the parties. They're not only curious, but as full of all-around impudence as anything I know. There's one of them now. Oh, you mean squirrels? Yes, just plain reds. Now watch this fellow. Down the maple trunk he came, with spasmodic jumps, and jumping down a perpendicular tree is not the simple matter it appears. Try it and see. On he came until within 5 feet of our heads, scolding in moderate tempo, neck at right angles, and tail jerking as though to add emphasis to his remonstrances. Some nature writers whose imagination is limitless could interpret his language, but not possessing their ability, I shall have to be content with a blanket translation to the effect that he wanted to know what all this hubbub was about under his own private tree, and would we get to Kent out of there. One could be in no doubt as to the tenor of his remarks, even if slightly acquainted with the saucy rascal. Hasn't he wonderful eyes? Yes, but his physical prowess is more remarkable. Watch him when he finishes his speech. After a short interval we were accepted as part of the scenery, and Chatterbox ascended the maple, ran along a horizontal limb, jumped to Apple Avenue, traversed this short thoroughfare, and in a few seconds reached Hickory Lane, then scampered up into the leafy haven until he found 3 nuts in a cluster, bit them off, and started down. His storehouse was in an old apple tree some distance away, and the trail he always followed was a devious one, including the descent of a dead cherry tree near his home cache. Transporting 3 hickory nuts, encased in their heavy husks, along this aerial highway is no slight engineering problem, so I slipped up behind the cherry tree to watch the maneuvers. In a few moments he landed on the tree's opposite side, and was within 2 feet of my head before he discovered me. What a blowing up there was! Billy Sunday's wildest denunciations would have seemed lullabies in the debate with the sputtering Vesuvius. Not alone at my head were invectives directed but at unnumbered ancestors. Even justifiable anger exacts a price, in this case 3 nuts which fell into my hands as he let them go. The loss was only temporary, however, for on a later trip he recovered them from a crotch where I had placed them. These little rufous-coated bundles of energy have given my mechanical bent many an interesting hour. The strength displayed in handling such a burden was amazing, but when walnuts are ripe, Hudsonicus becomes a regular Ajax. A husky red weighs about 15 ounces, and an unshelled walnut, let me see, I'll go and get one and find out. The scales say 3 ounces. The tree is about 25 yards north, and the storehouse is under a hemlock 230 feet away. Suppose you had to carry in your teeth 100 or more pumpkins weighing 30 pounds apiece, on the run, a couple of miles a day. How many do you think you'd transfer? I suspect the numeral 1 would be the answer, with a set of artificial molars required afterward, or perhaps a single round 0 would come nearer the truth. Some years ago I was driving a horse, yes, horse, not car, along the Kent Road. A red squirrel came down from a butternut tree to the rail fence and started along it with a nut in his jaws. We were going at a jog, and that fellow kept ahead of us on a zigzag path for half a mile, and then disappeared into a tree cavity. I pulled up alongside the road and waited. Soon he reappeared and headed back for the supply station. It was a warm October day, and there was nothing on my mind, so I lit the old pipe. Regards from the first mate anent its aroma, when I light up o' nights prove its ancient lineage, and timed that round trip. In 9 minutes he was back. The next journey was made in 9 1/2 minutes, a more dependable schedule than some of the trains on our road can boast. A valley friend drove by, returning from delivering milk at the station. "Hello, Rex. What are you doing all by yourself?" "Timing a red squirrel's trips between supply and storehouse." "Well, that all you got ter do?" "Get up." I suppose it did seem like a waste of time to that 18-hour-a-day dairyman, but you never can tell. Since he has seen some printed words of mine, his opinion has changed. A little ink and type work marvelous transformations in the minds of many. A non-entity, maybe, up to the moment these Aladdin marks appear upon a white page, and then, behold, an interesting member of the community. Although red squirrels are physically perfect, the mental processes of individuals do not always react successfully to sudden emergencies. Their knack of landing on their feet when falling is extraordinary. My fighting dog occasionally scares one, probably a youngster, into relinquishing his safe perch aloft for the ground, a leap of perhaps 15 or more feet. The little creature invariably hits the earth head up and ready to run. Pal has not caught one yet, and I hope she never will, although I haven't much fear that she would get the better of it. For a squirrel's teeth are sharp. Pal will tackle a woodchuck without hesitation, but is more cautious with the smaller animals. A friend of mine was driving his car along a cement road when a red squirrel landed just ahead on its back. A piece of dead branch was tightly gripped with all claws. Now, Red's natural tendency was to believe he was safe as long as he had his feet on a limb, and when this broke, his instinct did not react quickly enough to allow him to release his hold and turn in the air so as to land right side up. However, some members of the red squirrel family do think things out. Our grape arbor posts are of cedar, and although they have been in the ground nearly 10 years, some bark still remains. A few mornings ago a red was attempting to remove a long sliver of this bark. All his strenuous jerks were futile. One end refused to part from a nailed cross lathe. His chattering brought the real boss to the scene. She tailed on like a sailor, helping hoist the main topsail yard. I say she advisedly, for sex, aside from mannerisms, is a matter of conjecture, but even the combined yanking failed to tear the fibre loose. That efficiency expert wasted no time. Down she went to the base and bit it off. After a few comments on her mate's stupidity in not doing this at first, she helped him roll the booty into 2 compact balls so stray ends would not trip them, and lugged it off for nest lining. While I was clearing the weeds out of a small strawberry patch perched atop the east wall, which was built to level up the space on that side of the house, a red came bouncing along with a hickory nut. About 15 feet away he stopped, looked me over suspiciously, decided the passage wasn't safe, and hid the nut under a rock. Then he advanced cautiously, stood on his hind legs, whisked his tail several times, and finally decided I wasn't dangerous. Back he went to the hidden treasure, retrieved it, and raced past. The only flaw in a perfect argument for reason against instinct was that he stowed the food away while I watched him. The squirrel family's forehandedness in laying up the winter food supply results in storing away more than they can use where provender is plentiful. I have found 15 quarts of shelled hickory nuts in one cache. Little of this hoard goes to waste, however, for others, less energetic, steal the stuff. Blue jays and woodpeckers make off with beech nuts and chestnuts, and once I watched a chipmunk take hickory nuts as fast as a red deposited them in an old apple tree hollow. The striped imp waited until the provider was out of sight before making his foray. The hole was shallow and held 30 or 40 nuts, and the thief seemed to take away only those which were at it. Did the chipmunk leave the others for nest eggs? Here's a little point for the supernaturalist. A thing he did do was to miscalculate the time of one of Red's visits, and they met at the entrance. There was no doubt whatever about Red's understanding what Stripes was up to. A wild chase ensued, ending with the disappearance of Monk into his burrow. Old Dame Nature is usually particular in demanding obedience to her rules, but sometimes she nods. The law of survival of the fittest may be shelved. The strong help the weak, even unwittingly, as proved in the case of Stripes. But the weak, as represented by our red-furred friend in an encounter with the strong, as personified by the writer, are not necessarily backward in administration of a scolding. The chicken house has been tenantless for 2 years. I took it over occasionally to see that no geisties, ghosts, or leprechauns have made it their abode. One early summer day I pulled out a nest box and found it occupied by a red squirrel's small family. Mother was extremely reluctant to leave, and called shrilly for assistance. This arrived quickly along a limb just outside the open front of the house. She joined her rescuer, and I became the target of their combined remonstrances. Each raucous comment by Father was followed with 2 thin cheeps by Mother, who never failed to keep time with his lead, vary as he would. They kept it up for half an hour, seeming to be affected by that particular form of egotism possessed by those who love the sound of their own voices. Watching the red squirrels, I've often wished that the intense energy of these restless, quick-moving little fellows could be transformed into useful production. It would perform no small percentage of the world's work. Among their little-known accomplishments is long-distance swimming. One was taken aboard a canoe from a Maine lake after swimming 1/2 mile, did not appear to be tired, and undoubtedly would have made the nearby shore unassisted. In ratio to weight, this would mean that a 150-pound athlete who possessed relative endurance could swim 75 miles continuously. Aspirants for English Channel Marine honors, please note. Though there are 18 shellbark hickory trees on this quarter-square mile, only 3 of them bear seed, 2 which stand 50 feet from our porch, and 1 fine old patriarch a couple of 100 feet to the northwest. The others are on such thin soil that they have all they can do to exist, and lack the surplus strength necessary to produce nuts. Consequently, these 3 trees receive assiduous attention during daylight hours from reds and grays, and by night from moon-eyed flying squirrels. The line of approach to the 2-yard trees was along an apple highway. Last autumn I widened the jump to about 7 feet. Both species made it easily. Wire guards were put around the hickories, and more apple tree limbs severed until the only way to get at the nuts was to make an almost horizontal jump of 12 feet. These interferences did not prevent the grays from making their objective. That leap of a dozen feet was a thrilling exhibition of parabolic grace. If I possessed the same relative muscular strength, I could make the brook, over 800 feet away, in one hop. Though foiled at first, the Reds soon evolved a successful plan of approach. This necessitated an entire change in their tactics, and compelled them to start the attack at the base of a maple, which stands within a few feet of the porch steps. It is odd that an animal with sense enough to figure out a complicated transportation problem of this sort did not refrain from biting off nuts before they ripened, a plain case of appetite overruling the hoarding instinct. I've often seen red-tailed hawks attempt to capture gray squirrels in treetops, but have seldom witnessed a successful culmination of their efforts. Once, when I chanced to be well hidden in brush, the pursued acted as though he thought the hawk were playing some kind of game. He would slide around the limb and poke his head out sideways. "Never tagged me. Try again, old scout." In early spring, when sap begins its upward flow, both kinds of squirrels will gouge out hollows, usually in maples, more rarely in birch limbs, and drink the juice which collects there. While not exactly intoxicating, and outside Mr. Volstead's jurisdiction, the liquid certainly produces a somnolent effect, and the squirrels are most frequently captured by aerial prowlers when under its influence. Drink lightly from this maple bowl, lest hawks lug off thy furry soul. 2 such tragedies which I witnessed happened in the months of April. I wonder what business old Bacchus had wandering about at that time of year. I've often approached an imbiter by slow moves, and once actually touched some gray fur before it woke up. Most of us have at some time dreamed of falling from a tree. Of course, our dream is a hereditary transference from the days when man was arboreal. Maybe that one of our enemies in those far-gone centuries was some form of flying monster, and we released our hold for the same reason that a certain squirrel did, which I observed last autumn. I was enjoying an afternoon pipe in the hammock, watching lazy October cumuli drift across the western blue, when I saw a gray gathering seeds from the top of a tall maple about 200 feet up the hill. A dark spot appeared over the ridge, and slanted for the little forager. His method of escape was as simple as our dream. He let go all holds and disappeared in the underbrush. The ongoing pirate rose in a long sweeping arc, passed overhead, and I recognized one of our rare birds of prey, a dark form of the rough-legged hawk. Jim Burrows was at a loss to understand how the squirrels invariably cut through the thin side of a butternut closest to the meat. The reason they could always do this seems perfectly obvious to me, a sense of smell which in these animals is extremely acute. I collected some nuts and put them in a box in the workshop, thinking they were safe enough there. Not so. A squirrel went in through the open door, climbed up on the table, and carried off fully a quarter of the contents before I caught him at it. Then the box was covered, but the door left open purposely. Next morning there was a hole in the corner of the container, and nearly half the provender had disappeared. It is the same olfactory keenness which enables the squirrel to locate a nut or an acorn buried the previous autumn and retrieve it by digging through a foot of snow. As far as I have observed, this accomplishment is confined mainly to the grays, for they hibernate less than their rufous confreres, and are likely to roam abroad during any fine winter day. There is a belief current in the countryside that the gray is harried and driven off favorable feeding grounds by the red. In the abstract, there is a certain amount of truth in the notion, for the smaller animal does possess a more aggressive personality, and in an argument generally carries the day by sheer bluff, for in all his encounters I have witnessed, I've never seen any bloodshed. The fights are staged and follow through with loud battle cries and a continuous series of lightning-like retreats and offensives. Sometimes the antagonists become so engrossed in the argument that they appear to lose sight of everything save each other, and I have had them scamper across my feet, apparently without realizing that my underpinning was movable. Though not exactly a Cid in courage, the gray is by no means lacking in this virtue, especially when the youngsters are in jeopardy. I have a scar on the first finger of my right hand, where a gray squirrel bit to the bone when I incautiously reached into what I thought was a crow's nest. She bit and held on. I dragged the furry fury out clinging with teeth and claws, and shook her off. She caught on a limb a few feet below and came back, but fortunately not for me. The jar had evidently changed the current of her thoughts. Into the nest she went, and out she came with a tiny ball in her mouth. She seemed uncertain for a moment what to do, but suddenly remembered a nearby hole, and scampered over a waving limb to the refuge, while I scuttled to the ground. There is no doubt whatever which one of us was the more thoroughly scarred. She transferred her other 3 infants and stuck her head out of the hole. While not exactly making a face at me, she indicated quite plainly that she dared me to come on. There is an old grayback tending hereabout which has no respect at all for reds, Pal or me. While he is at work aloft, all others keep off, and he sees to it that they do. If an intruder starts to ascend the tree, he will carefully lay in a crotch the nut he is working on, and meet the advancing party more than halfway. What he does and says goes. In earlier days I spent much time among the fishermen of Maine, and with the insouciance of youth was seriously considering entering the profession of hauling the cod and haddock of Georgia's and Newfoundland banks into a dory for a livelihood. I drifted into another current, but contact with that strenuous life convinced me conscience and remorse had been sunk without trace. With large great bar anchors firmly attached, these two bugaboos would never trouble me again. An illusion, a certain sense of sportsmanship retired the shotgun as unfair, but I still clung to a .22 caliber rifle, and constant practice made this a deadly weapon at my shoulder. Targets were mainly old cans, bottles, etc., but in an evil moment I drew on a gray squirrel and wounded him. There is no satisfactory explanation of why some mental pictures endure more poignantly than others. They just do, and that poor animal proved my vauntedly extinct remorse was as much alive as ever. It happened many years ago. But as I write this all, the sharpness of that memory revives, and the recollection is anything but a pleasant one. The little gray victim with his coppery back was a martyr, though, who really accomplished reform. I made a gentleman's agreement with myself as he lay dead at my feet. Never again. And that promise was not merely a scrap of paper. End of chapter 10. Chapter 11 of Secrets of the Friendly Woods by Rex Brasher. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Whiskashon. Isolating two men in a cabin may be tantamount to manslaughter, as O. Henry remarked, and again it may not be. Joe and I spent a winter in an abandoned lumber camp near Moosehead Lake without getting into a fight. In fact, we parted in the spring like ideal honeymooners, without having had even an argument. And what's more, I know several men with whom I'd risk the same experiment today. I'm not going to name them, for fear they'd take me up on it. Such close contact reveals a man's inner nature as nothing else can, and one trait of Joe's stood out prominently. He was truthful. Many of the incidents in the following story, and that entitled Ghost to the Graylands, I extracted from him by main strength, for he was not given to talking, in which particular he was true to type, being a descendant of those taciturn French voyageurs who conquered the northern wilderness. When I told of seeing a snowy owl catch a trout, he was reminded of the first part of his story. And gradually we wove out of our experiences Whiskashon and Ghost of the Graylands. The factor, McLaren, was Scotch, therefore truthful, accurate, and a keen naturalist. Old Dr. Johnson might not agree with me, judging from his definition of oats, food for mules in Scotch. The luminous wonder of the northern lights blotted out the stars except in a small area to the southward. The sky, a sea of soft crimson, fading through many shades of pink into a space of elusive purple above the back trail. Then suddenly all the warm tints were gone. Cold greens and yellows filled the heavens. Great fingers of shimmering light rayed upward, quivering with prismatic colors as they faded and reappeared. By many a campfire Joe had watched the aurora pageantry before drifting to sleep. But now the gods were running wild, spreading every hue riotously across the broad canvas of infinity. Enthralled, he lay in his blanket while the glowing bands shot in league-long waves far beyond the zenith. Some show! The mail has got to go on, though. Tumbling out of his warm spruce bough-lined nest in the snow, Joe raked the campfire coals together and threw on fresh wood. As he took Coffee Pot and Spider from his sled, his glance fell on two tiny points of fire in a nearby evergreen. Never miss a trick, do you? Who asked you to join the outfit, anyway? Suppose you're going all the way to the post? Well, old-timer, we'll make it today all right if wind and snow hold off. The four huskies squatted in a semicircle while he made coffee. The leader, a magnificent animal, raised a paw against his coat. Want your breakfast, eh? Joe gave each a large frozen fish. Instead of wolfing down the food as do members of most teams, with intent of getting it out of sight, than stealing from others, they quietly gnawed away with half-closed eyes in undisturbed content. Joe had owned them for 2 years, and believing it possible to control dogs without whip or club, had trained them by methods of his own. "Can't be done," said other drivers. "A wolf's a wolf, and the only way you can make 'em mind is with a club." "They're not all wolf. I'm going to get at the dog in them. It can be done, and I'm going to do it." That first half-year was a long, tough fight, but Joe possessed patience, and slowly it dawned on the animals that he had determination also. During the first part of their re-education, forcible means sometimes were necessary, but he used a switch, not a club. Breaking them of stealing one another's rations was accomplished by the simple expedient of giving them enough food. In the North, life needs plenty of fuel to keep out the bitter cold, and very few living things, especially dogs, receive sufficient. Joe gave his team 2 good meals a day, either buying from Indians or catching extra fish himself. Near starvation had made them 3/4 savage, and it was many months before they were semi-tamed. Persistence accomplished the task, and now they took their positions between the traces quietly, ready and eager to go. Meanwhile, the feathered pygmy in the tree had been watching every move of Joe's breakfast preparations. "Suppose you've got to have yours, too. Come and get it," said Joe, holding out a piece of bacon. Unhesitatingly, the jay lit on his finger, grabbed the titbit, and started eating. "Here, I've got work to do," Joe said, shaking him off. "Beat it back to your perch." When the dogs were harnessed, Whiskashon lit on the sled, selected a crevice between packs, and settled comfortably in. "Where's your ticket? Who gave you permission to ride on this train?" The jay cocked his head, looked up with sharp black eyes, shook his feathers, and merely readjusted its position. "Foxy enough to wait until the dogs were buckled in, weren't you? Well, I guess that's ticket enough, but it's got to be punched." Reaching down, Joe caught the bird. It made little protest, even when held against a convenient tree and the end of its tail neatly cleft into a V with the axe. "There, now I'll know you. Get back into your seat and let's go." A crust over the deep snow, strong enough to hold a man, and under 2 inches of fresh fallen flakes, made traveling conditions perfect. Ahead stretched the wide river road flanked by walls of spruces, reflecting dimly the mutable aurora still flickering. "Mush on, old scouts. If the blizzard doesn't hit in, we'll be home by 3 o'clock." Into the fading prismatic path they went at an easy jog, the shrewd leader knowing better than to set a fast pace at the beginning of a day's run. Joe was behind at the pole. No need of breaking trail with snowshoes. In fact, they had been lashed on the sled every day this trip. He just tagged along easily, calling words of encouragement to the willing dogs swinging onward with their brushy tails as erect as totem poles. When the still dawn dissipated the pageant ahead, Nicktail came out of his nook, shook himself, eyed Joe, and flew off into the bordering trees. "So that's the game. Afraid to travel in the dark. Now it's light. Shake me cold." Joe was wrong. The bird was out for exercise, keeping a little in advance of the sled, scolding raucously now and then at other jays who attempted to cut in, or sent a flock of crossbills scurrying in all directions as he dived among them with a shriek. Toward noon the team was headed into a small grove and unharnessed. A little work with a belt axe and a small fire crackled. Water was boiling quickly, and before adding coffee, Joe used some to mix up a batch of pancake batter, having tempered it with a little snow. When cooked on one side, the flapjack was tossed, and just as it descended into the pan, Nicktail flew down, lit on the edge of the skillet, and attempted to seize a mouthful. When the heat hit through his cold feet, he went up in the air like a climbing black duck. "Well, you damn fool, maybe you'll wait next time. I've a good mind to let you go hungry for trying such a trick. Here, take this," and Joe tossed a bit of the cake toward the bird. It never touched the snow, but was neatly caught in mid-air and lugged to a nearby branch. In the stern code of the North, one lesson is learned quickly by all. Food, when found, must be devoured at once, or it may be seized by a lurking enemy. In this instance, fear of loss was not without foundation. Nicktail was rapidly gulping down pieces as large as he could manage. The job was almost finished when 3 gray forms shot in and dived directly at him. The last bit, an extra-large chunk, became wedged crosswise in his bill. He struggled desperately to swallow, but one of the jay robbers seized it and downed the morsel without effort. Food. There was more below. Down they swooped, 2 into the pan and 1 on Joe's shoulder. "Go on out of this, you nervy divils!" exclaimed Joe, sweeping them aside. "Stay off there till I'm ready to give you what's coming to you, if any." They stood in the snow within a few feet until he tossed them the last piece. As long as the trio saw more cake in Joe's hand, they remained close by. But when the final remnant was passed out, the recipient started for the woods with the other 2 in full cry. They realized that dinner was over. In the words of P. Henry, with the omission of 1 letter, "If that be reason, make the most of it." "I guess I'd better light out of here, or they'll come back and eat one of my dogs." The jays' cries ceased, then were renewed with wild accentuation. "Found something. Guess I'll slip in and see." The animated discussion centered around a horizontal spruce limb. In the dim light, Joe could not make out the cause of their remarks. When his eye focus adjusted to the gloom, he saw a martin stretched flat on a branch, motionless. While he watched, one of the birds ventured too close. A swift paw flick caught the aggressor across the back, pulled it to the martin's chest. A single snap, and for that brown-coated animal, dinner was served. "Maybe that'll teach the rest of you to leave a bit of chain lightning like that fellow alone. I don't know. Sometimes you've got sense enough, others just plain dumb. Anyway, he didn't get you, Nicktail. Come on if you're going the rest of the way. We've got to vamoose." About 3 o'clock they dashed into the post enclosure, heads and tails aloft, with all the flourish of a tally-ho. "Where did you pick up your friend?" asked McLaren, the factor, after greetings were over. He indicated Nicktail perched atop the sled baggage. "Joined the procession this morning. Had to carry him as a passenger until it was light. He traveled under his own power the rest of the way." "You mean he let you transport him on the sled?" "Just that. Stowed himself away among the sacks and hung on like a weasel to a rabbit." "That certainly is interesting. We'll keep an eye on him." A rubbish heap at the edge of the woods was a favorite hunting ground for jays that had congregated around the post for winter. The dogs, being well nourished and housed, did not bother rummaging among the debris. Excepting a few nocturnal prowlers, the birds had a monopoly. One day Joe saw Nicktail break open a pasteboard box containing beads which had been thrown away inadvertently. Seizing a bead, he flew to a limb, grasped his find firmly with the toes of both feet, threw back his head, and hit the bead with his bill, putting into the stroke all the strength of his neck muscles. In rapid succession, the shots were delivered so accurately that his toes were not struck. "If I could teach you to handle an axe, you'd be some lumberjack. I wouldn't swing a pick with that speed at anything between my feet. I'd lose a toe or 2, sure. Now I wonder if you're going to advertise your find as the other chumps do." Discovering it was not food, and that it was unbreakable, Nicktail grabbed a half-dozen of the glass globules and started hiding the treasures under crevices of bark. He worked in silence, swiftly and furtively. The box wasn't half empty before the band discovered what was up. Willing and enthusiastic assistance completed the job speedily. "Their sense of location," said the factor, "is remarkably keen. In the fall, when they begin to gather around the post, I often cut salt pork into pieces and throw a handful into the brush and grass. Very seldom do they fail to find every piece, sometimes more than a dozen in number. Many of the bits, of course, are in plain sight, but others completely hidden are found also. Their sense of smell does not aid them greatly, as we can prove easily. There are none in sight now, so we'll cover this piece of fish with a rag and see if they can find it." In a little while 3 birds appeared, one walking directly over the hidden food. "Now, if we show it's here," said the factor, raising the cloth, "we'll get action." They certainly did. He had scarcely lifted the covering before those 3 impetuous freebooters fell upon the fish, a squalling, fighting trio, dragging the prize off and away. Nicktail became very tame. Joe attempted, unsuccessfully, to lure him into the main room. The sky was the only roof he had ever known. A darker canopy made him suspicious. He clung to his roost in the dense evergreens, but was always on deck when Joe appeared, flying to greet him with rough notes of welcome, and usually alighting on his head or shoulder. When the bird perched on his finger, Joe marveled at his lightness. "You ain't any heavier than a robin, but look twice as big. Suppose it's that coat you've got on." Joe was right. The feathers were of a curiously rough texture. Each barb separated, not locked by hundreds of tiny hooks, as are some feathers. This was especially true of the underneath plumage. It was a wonderful air trap, keeping body warmth in and cold out. As cold increased, his feathers fluffed gradually until at 20 or 30 degrees below zero, Nicktail seemed an animated ball. Daylight hours were short, and Joe spent most of them tramping, adding many an interesting sidelight to his knowledge of wildlife. He had occasionally found excavations around mouse snow tunnels which puzzled him. Absence of footprints proved they were not made by animals. The mystery was cleared one day when Joe began digging with his mittens at a fresh mouse hole. Nicktail hopped in and added his bit by helping kick out the snow with his feet. "Well, now I know who is after those mice. Probably only tried to dig one out when you saw it dive in. Regular little husky for digging, ain't you?" Nicktail was an interested, tireless companion, and Joe always investigated side trips when the bird uttered calls of surprise. There was a distinct difference in the timbre of various cries, and Joe seldom made a mistake in correctly interpreting their significance. His loud alarm cries one afternoon led Joe to a cow moose helpless in the snow. She had foundered out of the beaten yard path, and struggling had so weakened her she was unable to return. With a snowshoe he cleared a course to the runway, dug the stranded animal free, slapped her on the back, and started her into the haven. "We'll keep this dark. If the Indians ever discover moose so close to the post, they'll clean 'em out in no time." This compact with himself and Nicktail was kept even to the extent of not telling the factor. Joe trusted McLaren, but there was just no need of saying a thing about it. On occasion Joe saw Nicktail peering into what seemed to be an old nest, about 15 feet up a small spruce. Closer observation revealed a bill sticking over the edge. Although this was early in March, temperatures well below zero were the rule, and it did not occur to Joe that any birds could raise a family under such frigid conditions. The right-angled limbs, spaced at convenient intervals, made ascent of the tree easy, and Joe's hand was almost on the mother bird's back before she flew off. Another Whiskashon. Looking down into the nest, he saw nothing but rabbit's fur and feathers. Slipping off a mitten, he pushed a finger down and found, under this warm coverlet, 4 eggs. Joe realized that if the mother remained away even for a short time, the eggs might freeze, although embedded in a wonderfully snug cache, so he descended at once, and had not reached the foot of the tree before the parent returned and settled down. "Well, you certainly are the original early bird to start your domestic operations with 3 feet of snow below you." "I'm hitting the trail tomorrow, Mac, and what to do with this bird I dunno. He's company all right, but he's trouble too. Besides, he wouldn't stick for 200 miles. He'd get down into that strange country and maybe lose himself. I'll grab him in the morning, and you keep him locked up for a few days." This program was followed, and Joe swung off on his southern route. When he returned late one evening, nearly 2 months afterward, his first query was, "How's old Nicktail?" "I let him out 2 days after you left," McLaren replied. "He wouldn't have lived another 24 hours indoors, and he tried his best to bust the window panes at that. He disappeared, and I didn't see him for weeks, but he's been round occasionally lately. Maybe you'll see him in the morning." "Chattering jays! How you do run on, Mac!" There was a hint, merely a touch, of far-off spring in the late April sun as Joe lit his pipe and stepped out next morning. The first live thing he saw was Nicktail atop a picket of the notch stockade, with 4 well-fledged dark grayish-brown youngsters decorating pickets. "Well, I'll be shot. I never guessed you were that kind of a bird." End of Chapter 11. Chapter 12 of Secrets of the Friendly Woods by Rex Brasher. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Ghost of the Graylands. Well, what do I do now? Dump these mailbags on the boggan or shoulder 'em? Some mess, grunted Joe as he stepped out of the canoe, gave his cramped knees a shake to ease their stiffness, his body one likewise to throw off the damp snow clinging an inch thick on his clothes. He hauled the birch bark up on a tiny semicircle of beach, turned it over, throwing out the heavy cargo of white flakes. I guess it'll be easier dragging the stuff. Firstly, I'll grease her up. The toboggan was taken from its cache, a piece of bacon rind rubbed over the smooth bottom, mail sacks and other duffel, arranged and firmly tied, then a drag on the old pipe and a short rest before starting the final lap on the 200-mile route. It was after 8 o'clock, but daylight still lingered. Twilights are long and pleasant in the North Country. Don't have to worry about setting these woods on fire, Joe remarked as he emptied his pipe. One good thing I'll say for this storm, though, it knocks skeeters and black flies. That's a heap big help, too, he added, looking at his red-blotched hands. Leaving the shelter of spruces, he bent his head to the moaning wind and started across the open barren. Joe knew that trail, could have followed it under any circumstances except blizzards. He was halfway, pulling hard on the reluctant boggan, leaning well forward. This is spring, eh? Month of May. His contemptuous growls were cut short by a terrific blow on the head. He turned his neck, glimpsing for an instant a great feathered form which sheared off and disappeared in the blinding snow. An old Wapakutho. I've never known one of 'em to have spunk enough for that. He touched a cold streak on his cheek. Damned if he didn't draw blood right through this fur cap. Now, I wonder, so that's it. His eyes rested on 4 eggs almost at his feet. Joe waited a few moments, thinking the bird might return. It did not, so he swerved to one side and went on. Maybe she mistook my cat for some kind of an animal and let go before she knew it was me. Probably scared some, too, or she'd come back. Well, old girl, I am coming back, and kind of keep watch of you and your family planted way out here in this open spot. Half an hour later, Joe entered the post's fenced enclosure and clasped McLaren's hand in undemonstrative northern greeting. Been looking for you the last 3 hours, said the factor. Your supper's on the table. Eat first, talk afterwards. A long speech for the factor. While Joe was satisfying his hunger in a more dexterous than delicate manner, the factor was sorting the mail, which was all for members of the post. Pipes were lit, rough chairs drawn before the fireplace, and the two men conversed with that restrained use of words bred in all who live in the silent places. Having most information to impart, Joe did the talking while the factor listened. It was one of 2 dissipations he indulged in yearly. The other was the coming of Indians with the winter's catch of furs to be traded in for supplies. Suppose the Ojibways haven't come down yet. Too thick to see if their teepees were outside when I got here. No, not yet. Except in this throwback, it's been an early spring, and I'm expecting them most any day now. The factor had noticed the scratch on Joe's forehead when he removed his cap, but made no comment or inquiry. Curiosity exists, but it is sternly suppressed among men of the North. It is part of wisdom, frequently, not to know. An old Wapakutho struck me about 2 miles back. Almost walked onto her nest. Never knew one to go after a man, said the factor. Neither did I. My head was down low. I guess she mistook the old mink cat for an animal. That's very likely. We'll go look her over. The birds are not rare, but their nests are seldom found. Sometime during the short night the snowstorm ceased, the early dawn breaking clear and warm. How about tramping a bit this morning, Mac? The breeze is strong enough to hold off the flies. All right. The factor called his assistant, telling him to watch the north end of the lake and fire a gun if the Indians appeared. Failure to meet them would give the HBC a black mark which it would take many years to erase. and the rival French post across the lake would greatly benefit from such a blunder. The bright sun and a strong southwest breeze were rapidly dissipating the damp snow. As they walked through the tundra, longspurs soared above them with tingling song. "Man, but they make me homesick," exclaimed McLaren, watching their spiral flights as they flooded surrounding space with melody. "Aren't there two kinds?" queried the matter-of-fact Joe. "Yes, that's the chestnut-collared longspur, with the black breast and brown band on the back of his neck. This one with dark head and throat, dropping toward us like a large butterfly, is the Lapland longspur." McLaren's comparison was apt. With wings held at an acute angle upward, down the lark came in long parachute descent, reaching earth in a short slanting flight. Male ptarmigans, their winter dress of white variegated with beautiful brown, mounted little hillocks, giving their peculiar hoarse-chuckling call. After the long winter, life was bubbling over, intent upon crowding all possible pleasure into the summer days. Reaching the nest, Joe and McLaren found the mother absent, nor did she return while they remained. Another egg had been added. "Looks to me as though some of the eggs were a good deal older than others." "Keen-eyed, Joe. They are laid at long intervals. You'll probably find one or two hatched if you come back in a few days." "See anything peculiar?" "Why, one of them is ridged lengthwise." "That's it. The snowy owl is the only bird I know who lays eggs like that." 3 days later, a fleet of 4 canoes debouched into the lake from the river a mile north. McLaren trained glasses on the white specks. Not the chief, part of his tribe from the western section. In irregular formation they came on. As each landed, the factor held out his hand. There was no word of greeting, only a steady, long hand-clasp. Tents or teepees were at once pitched, and crackling campfires gleamed brighter as the long dusk deepened. A flotilla of 5 arrived next morning. One of these Indians said to the factor, "Chief, him come, one son." How did he, who had spent the winter 50 miles east of his chief's camping ground, know? The setting sun was only a short distance above the far shore, but its oblique course would keep it in the sky for an hour when the chief and his retinue came into sight, strung out into single file, the distance between canoes maintained with military exactness. Among southern Indians, tribal customs are waning or have vanished. Not so here in the north. This chief stood in the bow of his canoe, silhouetted against the western sky, haughty, regal, a king, while his squaw drove the craft shoreward with deft, strong strokes. Factor and chief gripped hands. Sharp, beady black eyes looked long and intently into gray. Turning to each of his tribe ashore, the chief gave the same steady look and solemn hand-clasp. Not a spoken word. This ceremony over, the chief waved his hand to the floating canoes, and not until that permission was given did they approach land. From each birch bark, carefully wrapped bundles of precious furs were brought and stacked in front of the chief's tent, to be exchanged next day for trinkets and necessities. One would think that after enduring the hardships of an Arctic winter in gathering these treasures, the trappers would be anxious to know their worth in barter. They felt that way. They gave no indication of it. The morning was well advanced before the chief carried his pack into the post. In the old days, little sticks were given in varying numbers corresponding to each skin's value, and as many subtracted from the total as the numbers marked on the articles selected by the Indians until he had obtained all the goods his sticks would buy. Nowadays the Indians trust the factor's word. Although the chief understood little English, he watched every motion of the factor and his assistant as they appraised each skin. This transaction was business reduced to its simplest form. The factor valued the pelts, his assistant entering the amount under the owner's name. By nightfall the work was done. With a snap, Henry closed the large account book. The skins were stored in the loft, and the most important day of the year at the post was over. "Joe, how about letting me take your place this trip back? It's over a year since I've been outside, and I'm getting stale." "Suits me. Ask McLaren." The factor acquiesced readily. Henry left next evening, preferring to travel mostly at night, because then insects were less annoying. He went out light, the mail stowed away inside his pack, and Joe took up his duties as assistant. Mother Snowy was at home on the next visit, and so reluctant to leave that Joe almost stepped on her before she arose. This time she did not disappear, but circled in silence about 100 feet away. The gaping bills of 2 youngsters backed by pairs of large eyes greeted him, asking for food. They were a comical team, all eyes and mouth, bodies covered with dusky down. Joe constructed a small wickiup of willows in a nearby clump, where hidden he could watch the home life. By the middle of June the other 3 eggs hatched. 5 hungry mouths forced the mother into more extended foraging and gave Joe plenty of opportunity to slip into the blind unobserved. Sometimes in returning she passed directly over his head, but so noiselessly that he was not aware of her presence till her shadow slipped ahead. Just exactly what nature has in mind when she orders a variation in birthdays among young birds of the same family is a mystery. As Joe watched, it was evident that the firstborn had considerable advantage over his younger brothers and sisters. He possessed twice the size, aggressiveness, fighting determination, and persistency, enabling him to obtain the largest share of food. So strenuous was his insistence that Mother finally cuffed him out of the nest before the smaller ones could get anything to eat. Aided by her efforts to apportion the food equally, the others obtained a fair share, although the bully usually scrambled back and got more than his portion. This summer, however, it made little difference in their development, for game was plentiful, and both parents were clever, industrious hunters. As the pleasant days passed, Joe saw brought to the nest at different times nearly every variety of small animal found in the vicinity. The male acted as purveyor occasionally, but in a casual and indifferent way. Apparently he forgot for long intervals all domestic duties, and then appeared to remember suddenly and tried to redeem his sins of omission by frequent relays of provender. He seldom helped in dismembering any, just dropped the food and made off. It is possible that Lothario has disciples in the far north. There were many bird victims, although these were generally large species. Small ones were seldom bothered, a pair of snow buntings raising a family successfully nearby. Young ducks predominated in the feathered menu, and Joe was fortunate enough to observe, from a knoll overlooking a small pond, the capture of one of these aquatic sacrifices. A mother redhead and family, the youngsters well feathered but still unable to fly, were breakfasting in the shallows of this pond. Suddenly all disappeared. The next moment, Wabakutho's gray form hovered above. A head showed. She struck, but only wet her claws. She could see the duck beneath the surface, and followed so closely that the swimmer had slight chance to catch a breath. The 4th time the duck rose, it lingered an instant too long at the top, and was seized by the menacing shadow. Wabakutho did not make the mistake of shifting attack from one to another, but pursued the selected one relentlessly till she captured it or the duck reached safety among overhanging branches on the bank. In looking over some bird books in the factor's scant library, Joe learned Harfang was one name applied to the snowy owl. Harfang, eh? Just fits that overgrown scrapper. I'm going to tag him. He scratched the name on a thin band of brass, and after a struggle, during which the fighting imp's claws nicked his hands, Joe succeeded in fastening it loosely on one leg, so the growing bone would not be bound. Henry returned in July, and when Joe started south he stopped at the nest. "Well, so long, you fellers. Maybe I'll see you again, maybe not. It's a wide country. As for you, Fang, you'll get along. Keep away from all 2-footed animals and some 4-footed ones. They're bad medicine. Don't crowd the rest of 'em like that. They've as much right as you have, you overgrown bully." The youngsters were fully fledged by the middle of August, but refused to leave home. Why should they? There was always plenty of food, and it was comfortable snuggled down together in the lengthening cool nights. One morning they awoke to find Mother gone, nor did their plaintive squeals recall her with the regulation breakfast. About noon she appeared, a rabbit in her talons, and lit atop Joe's deserted wickiup. The youngsters' pleading cries to bring it nearer were unheeded. She arose, hovered directly above those yawning caverns, wiggled the bait enticingly, went on, dropped the victim 50 feet away. Harfang started for it, half scrambling, half flying, the others trailing. In the ensuing melee, Bunny's tender flesh was torn to bits, each youngster obtaining a share proportionate to his attacking energy. Mother's strategy was repeated. The next bait was dropped farther away. By dusk the young owls had traveled some distance from the nest, and instead of attempting to return, made themselves fairly comfortable in a willow thicket by burrowing into the deep, soft moss. Trying his wings next day, Harfang found he could lift his weight, he could fly. He celebrated this achievement by fluttering with short wing beats to one of the previous day's kill, on which he made a fairly satisfactory breakfast. When nature accentuates one sense beyond normal, it is usually at expense of the others. She has been generous with owls, giving them a keenness of vision and hearing seldom equaled. With pupils contracted to the size of a pea, the snowy owl endures the glare of the vast northern wastes of snow and ice, a test which puts a human eye out of commission in a short time. These wonderful organs are further protected by semi-erectile, coarse bristling feathers which keep off the driving snow and enable the snowy to do most of its hunting in daylight. A tiny squeak issued from the grass far at one side, so distant that nothing but an owl could have heard or located its exact direction. The mouse saw the gray shadow, ran for safety toward its runway, but it was too late. Harfang had it gripped tightly in his needle claws. The sun's arc narrowed in the south. Nights grew longer and colder. From the marshes, ducks rose in irregular flocks, mingled, formed in long V's, and straightened away to the southward. Pibroch calls of geese, coming from their more northern home, fell on the night air. Most small birds had disappeared weeks before. The sense of restlessness in the atmosphere seized Harfang, so, by easy distances, mainly at night, for he had learned already that daylight traveling was dangerous, he followed, tearing wherever food was plentiful. In the early winter he came to a country covered with a network of small streams and lakes. The water spaces were frozen, but turbulent brooks were open. His ghostly form, gliding silently along one of these streams, seemed the materialized spirit of the waters. Scarcely pausing in his flight, he swiftly extended one leg, gave it a sudden backward sweep, and with his two front curved claws hooked a fine trout. Then the leg automatically bent, throwing in the rear claws. A clever and neat method of fishing, very different from the clumsy dive of the fishhawk. Harfang was an artist in piscatorial ways, the fishhawk a determined craftsman. The luminous areas, as they became larger and more numerous, the owl avoided, for by daylight he saw those places contained a great number of little boxes filled with two-legged animals. The snow diminished as Harfang moved onward. Here were brown fields and gray woods, splashed at intervals by dark groves of evergreen toward which he gravitated naturally. They were like home. Within their thick growth he remained hidden by day, ranging abroad in early morning or late evening for food. Hunting by daylight would have been easier, but it was too risky. One December night, while winging forward beneath the waning moon, he came to a lake which seemed unbounded. Onward he flew for miles, and at last a dim shoreline appeared, apparently snow-covered. Sweeping downward and alighting, he looked around astonished. The ground was white but not cold, and gave easily under his feet. Mice were at play everywhere. He caught half a dozen in as many jumps, found a thick growth of cedars, and turned in. In the morning, from a dune crest, for the first time he surveyed the ocean. That was too large a lake to attempt crossing. He would stay here for a while, where rabbits and mice abounded. A small flock of fish-crows, coursing for clams above the break of surf, discovered and began baiting the marble-like figure. "Hey, fellers, where did this guy come from? Let's muss him up a bit." "Righto, isn't that the haughty thing?" And just there that crowd of dusky freebooters made a serious mistake. They had ballyhooed large-eyed sedate gentlemen before, but the previous victims had been dark-colored, and took their berating in stolid silence. One ventured to thrust its claws at Harfang from behind. That was the last endurable gesture. There was a sudden eruption of great wings, claws, and fierce yellow eyes, and Harfang's talons were driven through the vitals of one of the aggressors. Dropping the inert bunch of sable feathers, he caught another, a terrific constriction of the sharp nippers, and it joined its mate on the ground. The rest dived frantically into the cedars and bayberry bushes. "Didn't think he could see you in daylight, eh?" remarked a man who had been watching the battle, through glasses, from a bunch of dwarfed evergreens 200 yards away. "Well, smarties, that was one of the times you all slipped up. Maybe it will teach you to let the white ones alone. There's two, though, which you'll never learn." Toward the latter part of December, the belated snow arrived one evening. Harfang, circling the dunes and marshes, was caught in a blinding flurry which came out of the north butt end foremost. He had been close to the southern point of the beach, and when he dropped, seeking the earth, he found instead of the long finger of Monomoy, crested seas whipped white by the rising gale. He tried to beat back, but the wind, already blowing 50 miles an hour, made the effort futile. Heading into the teeth of the roaring air current, again he edged downward, hoping to find solid ground. Instead, white-capped waves snarled back at him. He swung off before it through the black night. There was plenty of strength left in the powerful body when two swaying circles of light shone ahead. Tacking sharply into the wind, Harfang slipped easily over the bulwarks, alighting on the heaving deck almost at the lookout's feet. Exhausted birds seeking shelter were no novelty to the crew of the Nantucket lightship, but never had a visitor like this arrived. The man picked him up, opened the galley door, and put him into a corner. Harfang snapped his bill repeatedly, glared very fiercely, but made no attempt to use his claws. "Say, Cookie, I got a Christmas turkey for you. Came aboard last night. He isn't exactly a regular turkey, being white, but where is he? Here in the galley. Take a look." "Turkey, eh? Well, that's one of them ghost owls that flies around in snowstorms. What's he got on his leg? Here, hold these fish hooks and hold 'em tight while I see." "Harfang? That's a funny name. What does it mean?" "How'd I know? Sounds like Chinese for claws to me." Marooned for months in the winter, those who man these floating outposts of civilization look upon any untoward happening as vastly interesting. Harfang soon became a full-fledged member of the crew, and shook down into an unusually docile pet, considering his wild ancestry. First there was much difference of opinion about his food. "No, he won't eat corned beef. You got to have it alive." "Well, outside of the bunch that's manning this bucket, we haven't got anything alive, not even a mouse. Let's try him with fish." The line was baited, and a 2-pound hake hauled over the side, which had hardly hit the deck before Harfang was straining at the end of his lanyard. "Ah, that's the answer," said the captain, and it certainly was. Catching fresh food for their feathered shipmate was a daily diversion for the boys. Harfang kept in good condition physically by a daily dozen, which only a bird could perform. Rising above deck as far as the restraining twine would permit, his great wings moving through a half-circle with extraordinary swiftness, he remained suspended for minutes at a time. He seemed to have the same wing angle control as a hummingbird when poised in one spot. This remarkable exhibition always drew an audience. "How does he do it without making some noise?" onlookers queried. The silent action was possible because of the texture of the wing feathers, soft, almost downy, yielding to the air as more rigidly interlocked primaries do not. April came. The great bird sat for hours on the gunwale, watching wistfully long lines of shearwaters following shifting contours of waves with incredible ease, their stiff wings set at an unvarying right angle. When flocks of scoters appeared, headed north, his uneasiness increased. "Guess we'll have to loose the old fellow," said the captain one morning. "He wants to go home." The restraining lanyard was cast adrift, and Harfang swung aloft, free. Then, guided by that mysterious sense of orientation, he headed straight north toward the dwarf alders and willows, for the far land where he was born. Here one morning, Joe, trudging across the barren, caught a glint of metal reflect in the early sunlight. "If that ain't old Harfang! Now I wonder where you been all winter." End of Chapter 12. End of Secrets of the Friendly Woods by Rex Brasher.